And then we'll have a second panel that will allow us to engage around lessons learned, also as we prepare for a very important 2026 local government elections, but also to keep an eye on other elections happening in Africa this year and next year. And then more importantly, in next week, here in Cape Town, just a block away, we'll have our first G20 Finance Minister and Business 20 track, and already we've seen yesterday the main news around the G20, but also finding key points of how we can ensure that we counter the disinformation campaigns that we've already seen coming up. But first, I would like to invite the ISS Director, Executive Director Fonte Akum, to open this conference and give us a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. A round of applause for Crystal, please. Distinguished panelists, distinguished authors as well, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to this seminar. And as Crystal said, it could not have come at a better time. For the Institute for Security Studies, I think it's worth taking a step back and looking at the trajectory that got us here. The year was 2016, during which technologies were said to have played a disproportionate role in swinging Brexit, leading to the EU's exit from, the UK's exit from the European Union. Much later in the year, we saw the role of technologies again shaping the outcomes of the US presidential elections, with President Donald Trump being elected, winning the Electoral College without winning the popular vote, which went for Hillary Clinton. So the razors, or the margins, were razor thin. Then we came in to the COVID-19 pandemic, where the use of information, misinformation, disinformation, and false narratives also shaped the battlefields between the vaccine skeptics and the vaccine proponents. While we have looked at the use of technologies in the management of elections, they are also increasingly playing a role in the ways in which people and communities mobilize during electoral processes. If it was just about the technology and the right amount of information, then the study might not be that relevant. But we are more interested in some of the narratives that emerged out of the 2016 US elections. Narratives around fake news, false information, alternative fact, alternative interpretations to similar fact, and so on and so forth, which basically set the globe into a space of info wars. And today, we're actually seeing a lot of that play out again in the backs and forths between the US and South Africa, between South Africa and Rwanda as well. So as we shaped the current ISS strategy, which has run since 2021 against the backdrop of COVID-19 in 2020, we actually situated the issue of disinformation and misinformation as an emerging threat, locating it at the intersection between two strategic impact areas: governance, peace and security, and national and transnational crimes and violence. The reasons were simple. Technologies are borderless. Those who handle them as well form communities which cross borders. The second observation is that with the introduction of artificial intelligence, technologies actually outpace the regulatory environment within which they are inserted. The third observation is that beyond the regulatory environment, the enforcement is really complicated, given that it's extremely challenging to actually trace the origins and the specific devastating impact of false narratives. The intent is equally extremely difficult to prove. So in fact, as Karen likes to put it, one of the authors of the report, and the person who has been leading a lot of our work on disinformation, it is a moving target. And that, it is that moving target that the ISS is preoccupied with, because it does not only imperil the state of governance on the continent, within countries, between countries, it also imperils livelihoods. We have seen the way false narratives actually drive communities escaping from violence towards violence in certain places on this continent. We have seen ways in which false narratives have actually shifted humanitarian support from one space to another on this continent. So it's something that we take very seriously because lives do depend on it. And as we go forward, it's not just about the narrative, it's also about the capacity and the limited cost in producing deep fakes. Deep fakes, which I heard during my advisory board meeting a couple of days ago, communities in rural spaces which have access to technology receive this information, and they would think you have Donald Trump endorsing one side of a local conflict. And just that perception of the endorsement shifts the conflict dynamics in that local space. So ladies and gentlemen, the ISS is absolutely interested in this issue, which would ride into the next strategy as well. But I'm hoping that today we would begin to actually come to maybe not a common understanding, but a diverse understanding of what the issues are. I hope that at the end of the day, we would each identify the opportunities that we have as individuals and as individuals within organizations in playing a role in actually protecting our democratic governance institutions and in protecting communities from the challenges posed by the pervasive use of new technologies. I'm not saying that technologies only bring challenges. Of course, they have opportunities as well. But one bit of a false narrative with intent to destroy is extremely difficult to actually rein in, pull back, and do anything about. Thank you very much, Crystal.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Fonte, for really setting the context and also, I think, the words that stand out, a moving target. So I'm sure in the next few months and years we'll have more reports coming from the ISS, and that it will be supported not only by South African funders but also global funders. So I would like to introduce you to the first panel, but firstly, as I indicated, we have an in-person audience here and we've also got an online audience, and so please, we will have ample time for a Q&A, because part of ensuring that we unpack and get some nuances from our panelists is obviously through questions. So there will be, for the online audience, you'll be able to send your questions via WhatsApp, which will then be fed to me. So I'd like to introduce you to our panel, of course, Karen Allen, lead author of our report, with co-author Jean. They will come on stage and give us some inputs via a slideshow, and then the other panelist will be joining us, which is Tabelo Tabs Timse, our ISS consultant. Then, of course, Josias from GCIS. Thank you so much. And then, thank you very much. We've got the Chief Electoral Officer of the IEC in our audience, Simon Mabola, who will also be joining us on the panel. Thank you so much. Karen, I will call you to the floor to give us an outline, a brief outline of this very important report and some of the key issues and nuances. Thank you so much. Karen Allen.
Thanks, Crystal. Lovely to see everyone here, and thank you for making it to the other side of the sonar. I'm not going to make it a lengthy presentation. What I want to be able to do is talk you through the main parts of the report. But as I have to say, I'm the spokesperson for the report, but actually it was very much a collaborative effort with Murmur Intelligence, with my colleague Jean Roux, and also with Tabs Timse. And what we tried to do was to try and understand the influence environment during the elections, and we want to understand the macro influence environment during the elections, who were the main communities, and we also used open source investigative techniques to try and understand how the main influence actors work their narratives, and how we understood their motivations and what their networks are. And I'm a journalist at heart, so this was the best bit in my view, understanding what was happening in a real-world context. So doing those field interviews to try and work out whether the macro picture that we were getting and the OSINT really matched up with what we were seeing in the field. Just a really important reminder, one of the foundational principles of democracy is access to information and verifiable information. And while social media platforms, as Fonte has indicated, have allowed us to achieve great strides, and particularly access to information, and the way we receive information to inform our decisions on voting, there are also potentially malign consequences. Because you have to remember that social media platforms are designed, or how their algorithms are designed, to rank and prioritize feeds of information based on what is popular, not based on what is verifiable or fact. Makes them very different from newspapers or news sites. I'm going to say that again. They prioritize and rank what is popular over what is verifiable fact. And as a result, there is an incentive to make your issue, to make your narrative trend. It sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but it's really important to bear in mind. And the reason why is because something that I've learned from my incredible colleague Jean Roux is that it's not just about what's being talked about, it's not simply about fake news. It's about how we receive the information, how our worldviews are shaped by the information that we get on our social media platforms. So I'm saying that really as a precursor to introducing you to the report, because I think it's very important to understand why we've looked not only at what's being said, but how it's being said. So our key findings, and I'm going to go through just some of these, is that we saw that South Africa, like other settings, had an active market for online influence. Some of the influencers were paid to amplify key narratives. They were doing it purely for financial gain, or to game the algorithm, to effectively play the rules by which we receive our information to ensure those narratives trend. Some of them were political influencers engaged on the basis of ideology, and I think this is very much a reflection of the political ecosystem in South Africa, that many of the influencers weren't just doing it for the money. There were many who were doing it either for a combination of money and ideology, or purely for ideological reasons. But I think what's really interesting in this report is that we saw evidence of leveraging links with continental networks of influencers. And what that meant was, and this came out, you'll see with the case studies, that by working together and learning TTPs, techniques, tactics, and processes from other influencers and other settings, they were able to use various devices to build their own audiences, either by engaging in adversarial spats online or by picking up on things that were happening and talked about in other areas of the continent. And Kenya was a case in point that, and I know there's other work that's been done since our report that has basically underscored that. We saw the early seeding of disinformation narratives, that many of those disinformation narratives happened many, many months before the election, to effectively, in some cases, prepare the electorate. This was going to be an election that wasn't going to be free and fair, and therefore if the result didn't reflect our particular party's desire to win the election, it must have been rigged. Preparing the electorate for what was to come, and that was a barrage of disinformation messaging, undermining the IEC, the electoral process, the counting, the preparation, and ultimately the result. We saw the use of narratives that were targeting the electoral processes of the IEC. We'll go into those in a bit more detail. And technical glitches experienced by the IEC, and this happens in elections across the world, they were framed as malicious attempts to sway elections. We saw the prominent use of lawfare to justify rigging allegations. What that effectively means was, and there were some legal cases that were fully justifiable, but there were also what one might arguably describe as malicious legal cases which sought to question and use the legitimacy of the courts to be able to question the electoral process, to leverage that online, and then to quietly drop the court case after all. We have a phrase in the UK, there's no smoke without fire, and I think that was essentially the tactic that we saw there. People asked us about deep fakes, and I know Fonte mentioned deep fakes a moment ago. We didn't see the extensive use of AI that many of us had predicted, and this has certainly been borne out by other research that's been done. But what we did see was a lot of audio and video taken out of context, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment, to support vote rigging allegations. These are called cheap fakes, but effectively crude attempts to try and distort timelines and to distort narratives. We saw the use of rage bait, coordinated adversarial exchanges to build engagement. No news as good as bad news. Basically, it's the same principle. You have a spat with someone online, there's a barrage of comments that wade in. It helps to elevate your presence in people's feeds. And so we saw very, very extensive use of rage bait. Unlike other studies, we saw a lot of rage bait involving journalists. In South Africa, we didn't, and huge testimony to the South African traditional legacy media environment that was very robust in the face of disinformation attempts. We didn't see them, by and large, being dragged into adversarial spats by influencers. There is obviously a lot of interest in to what extent we saw the presence of foreign actors. This was an actor-agnostic study. What that means is we didn't go in it with a preconceived view of looking at particular actors, but what we can tell you is two things. A, as expected, we saw the weaponization of discussions on issues that were pertinent in the news: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, with South Africa's particular position on those issues. But what we didn't see is a dominance of foreign narratives in the feeds. We looked at to what extent a number of different foreign country issues were being mentioned online during the course of the elections and the months leading up to the elections and the months afterwards. It amounted to 4% of the volumes of conversations. It's tiny. What I need to say by way of a rider to that is that there's other work that's been done, by Murmur in particular, that looks at how local narratives are leveraged by international actors to give the impression of a local discussion and to effectively infiltrate genuine domestic debates on an issue. But when we looked at the volumes, it was very, very small. Again, as part of that very limited evidence of nation-state influence operations. Again, very, very difficult because of being able to verify and identify who the actual actors were. But definitely more research required on that. But we had no way of necessarily knowing whether certain sock puppet accounts were being used by nation-state actors. Attribution is a huge, huge issue in this area of research. But huge tribute to fact-checking organizations that were able to debunk and quickly call out examples of disinformation when they occurred. So just quickly, the methodology that we used, it's a 3-point methodology. We talked about using data analytics to give us a worldview, an overview of what the influence ecosystem looked like. We then use open source intelligence techniques, investigative techniques. We don't like to use the word intelligence when there are journalists in the room because it always makes it feel very spooky, but this is all open source material to be able to understand what was being said and what were the connections between the different actors. And we conducted field interviews with some of those that were engaged in influencing. We used X and we used Facebook for the study, largely because these were platforms that we could get access to and access to data. And that's a huge, huge issue for researchers in being able to get affordable access to platforms and get the data that is meaningful for us. As part of the big picture, looking at the key communities of influence, so this is the macro picture, we were able to break down the different communities or the different groups that were online during the course of the election. And what was very interesting is that the MK party, a new entrant into the electoral competition, had only been in existence 6 months before, generated 25% of the votes in our sample. That's quite a lot of activity. And they almost certainly were using paid influencers as part of that. We know EFF, which was not far behind them, they also had the use of paid influencers, and we were able to speak to some of them. So basically a very, very high level of noise online, slightly disproportionate to the final electoral outcome. It's interesting that other parties like the Democratic Alliance, that community, scored very, very low in terms of their engagement. And that seems to have been as a result of the fact they used different techniques to be able to campaign or to amplify their message. They use more traditional digital advertising, bill posters. That's not to say there were not attempts to try and mimic what they were doing, and you weaponize that for a disinformation campaign. And Jean will be able to talk to you about that a little bit more in just a moment. I'm going through this quickly because I want to try and give as much opportunity for questions in a moment. Just a really important point to talk about. We're looking in particular at inorganic engagement. And people say, well, what's the difference between the two? You and I have a conversation online. We have a debate. We disagree. We spat. But the fact that we talk to each other in a way that one might do around a dinner party conversation or in a debating hall, very much based on organic engagement. It's true public sentiments, real conversations between voters to help shape informed opinions. By contrast, inorganic engagement is manipulative. We talk about gaming the algorithm. They're tactical manipulations with an aim to influence or in an undemocratic or non-transparent manner. Because what it means is I may receive material that I think as a consumer of information online, I assume that it's an authentic conversation, that it's authentic engagement, but actually an echo chamber is being built and my worldview is being shrunk as a result. So an important point to note. Key narratives. Overwhelmingly, the narratives were largely related to how the elections were prepared, how the elections were run, allegations of vote rigging. We saw claims suggesting that IEC officials were somehow partisan. We saw particular targeting of one particular electoral official, Janet Love, in what was a very, very personal, highly publicized campaign. We saw targeting of the electoral process. We saw examples of voter suppression, i.e. confusing voters on election day to try and either deter them from particular voting areas or just to sow confusion and discord. There were claims of foreign influence with organizations that receive some funding from Western donors being penned as being partisan and being unable to provide independent verification of the elections. And we saw other narratives that tapped into fears that exist in South Africa. We saw race-based narratives, we saw xenophobia, we saw land-based, land expropriation narratives that were very, very prominent. And we saw attempts to try and promote regional destabilization and secessionism. And again, we go into that in quite a lot of detail in the report. Just on that last point, I talked about an example of decontextualized video, and this basically fed into the narrative about the Cape independence movement, the secessionist narrative that was very much present during the election campaign. This particular piece of content was circulated quite widely by a particular account, the No to Cape Exit. And it was trying to stir the pot to suggest that there were people that were being detained, that black people were being detained for walking after hours, and they were being detained by AfroForum and the Cape Independence Movement. And there was pictures, and pictures tell 1,000 words to try and provide evidence of this. Africa Check very quickly called this out and investigated the images and found that they related to taxi arrests that happened in 2023 and during the course of violence, where there were arrests that were made associated with taxi violence. Absolutely nothing to do with the election. But again, you see a piece of content like that and you glance at your feed very casually, the message is conveyed very strongly. I'm going through this pretty quickly because I think what makes the report really, really sing and really enriches it in a way that a lot of other studies haven't been able to, is to be able to understand who are these influencers? What are their motivations? Who is paying for them? Who are their networks? Are they doing it for ideological reasons? Are they doing it for a paymaster, or are they doing it for financial gain? And we have 3 case studies that we highlight in the report. Just to give you a little bit of a sneak preview of 2 of them. We were able to conduct interviews with a very, very prominent and very, very experienced influencer to get an idea of what the influence environment looks like in South Africa generally, whether it be during the election or be it just at any other time. And what was very, very clear is that this individual was able to give us some insights into how he engaged with Kenyan influencers to be able to build his own engagement, but also to be able to build his own know-how. He engaged in antagonistic exchanges with other influencers to be able to enhance their audiences in terms of volumes of audiences, but also to be able to, in a way, parasitically feed off each other. He talked about a network, the K2 network of influencers that effectively exchange views, exchange tactics, but also build engagement. That's now expanded to other countries, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria, where we're seeing other influencers operate in a coordinated way. And if there's anyone with deep pockets here, I would suggest it would be an incredibly important piece of research to understand the regional or continental links between these influence networks. I think what was very, very clear, and this was quite typical of a number of other case studies, was this equivalence that the influencers position themselves between them as people of influence and mainstream media. Everyone is a journalist when you're on social media. And there was a sense that we are there at the coalface, we're able to provide really verifiable evidence of, for example, vote rigging. When actually the difference between mainstream media and between an influencer or an eyewitness is effectively the professional need to be able to verify sources and to be able to provide context. Many of the tactics that he used was to flood posts of traditional media stories to run counter narratives. Again, do you remember I said the comments are as important as the original narrative that was seeded? So he was very, very clear in underscoring that role. And he's worked on campaigns during his influence career in other countries, including Malawi and Tunisia and Liberia, approached through agents and third parties. There is an influence market which is extremely active, it's extremely lucrative, and he had every intention of continuing in that vein. And I think during the question and answer session, you may want to ask a few more questions of Tabelo, who interviewed him directly. Just a quick glimpse at a second case study. This is one of the top 20 influencers in South Africa, very, very prominent during the elections. He ended up getting kicked off social media platforms in June, but he was the originator of a leaked letter, which was allegedly from the DA. It was a fake letter that talked about efforts to try and undermine the GNU talks. It was about infiltrating the talks and being able to take the ANC down. It was a leaked letter, and it effectively got him taken off social media platforms. He claimed to have generated the hashtag boycott IEC. Again, hashtags get used to elevate a narrative in the algorithm. He claims to have been paid by Russia to amplify destabilizing narratives. We have to rely on his words for this. We've got no reason to disbelieve him. He was unable to give us a lot of granular detail on that, but he did talk about being approached largely through DM, if I remember rightly, through direct messaging or through WhatsApp, and he was paid for his services via PayPal or directly into his account. Again, this was not a study following the money, but it gives it gives you some crumbs to follow in future studies to understand how the paymasters are effectively pulling the strings of South Africa-based influencers. There's a lot of money to be made. He was paid 40 to 50 rand every time he liked a post. The amounts of money were much, much higher for generating posts. And he claims that he was approached to run a campaign in Zimbabwe to undermine the opposition, to undermine the MDC. He told us that he was not prepared to work on that campaign and decided to work for the MDC instead. But again, who is the highest bidder? To what extent does ideology play an influence with this particular influencer? He really was a kind of hybrid influencer. He was driven by the money, but he also had an ideological association with his price. Let's put it that way. Jean will talk in a few minutes a little more about the real world online offline interplay, which is one of the case studies that we've looked at. But I just wanted to quickly end with this, the role of the traditional media in South Africa. The traditional media is very much the fourth estate, holds power to account. In South Africa, we are lucky to have a robust traditional media. We cannot take it for granted. That's not the case at all in the rest of the continent. But I think we have to give credit to the fact-checking organizations, Africa Check, Media Monitoring Africa as well, for calling out inauthentic content when it appeared. We'll hopefully hear a little bit more about the Real 411 platform that Media Monitoring Africa established to be able to give social media users the opportunity to call out information. We also need to acknowledge the Government Communication Service, GCIS, which was involved in creating a network of people that were watching the information environment to be able to make sure that there was situational awareness, if I can use that phrase, to be able to understand what was going on and potentially respond to it. And we also saw the danger of a fragmented media landscape. One of the things that has become very apparent in South Africa over the past few years is this equivalence, as I talk about, between traditional media and various social media platforms or websites, alternative news websites that are being established that gain credibility to stand in competition with mainstream media. Not going to say too much more. The recommendations are in the report. I think digital literacy is very much at the core. I know we say it at every single event like this, but it is such a fundamental principle. For me, it's targeted digital literacy training, particularly with government communicators, with the IEC. I know already there is a lot of work that gets done with the IEC in this respect, but it is a moving target. And so the need to constantly be aware of the latest developments, the latest tactics that are being used, the latest narratives is important. But I think also we need to be quite clear that the platforms have a role to play in understanding context, particularly context within South Africa in particular, and Africa more generally, and to understand the kinds of narratives and the need for responsiveness and takedowns where required. And again, I think later in the day we'll hear a bit more from Media Monitoring Africa on that. But I think ultimately the importance is to reinforce the role of traditional media as a democratic pillar and support more robust training of journalists, not just at college, but in the job. Last week, we spoke to editors who are working across the main media organisations in South Africa, and they have been crying out for support for their journalists to, first of all, understand what their role is as a journalist. It's not a stepping stone to becoming an influencer, or it's not a stepping stone to get those great MC gigs, but actually it's a very, very important role that gets played in any democracy, but also to understand the changing nature of influence and the changing nature of the news environment. I'm going to leave it at that, and perhaps I can ask, if I may, Jean, just to give us just some insights. We don't have slides for this specifically, but just into the online, offline interplay with our third case study.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I see in the introductions, I'm still listed with my old employer at the Atlantic Council. I'm not sure how they feel with it. I've moved on for about a year now, so they'll probably be surprised to see my name still there. But yeah, basically the study, as Karen mentioned, broadly, we were looking at what was going on. We weren't specifically going out to find specific actors, to find specific behaviors. We went in this blind, so to speak. As she mentioned, we approached it from these three angles. We looked at the broad, almost the macro view. That's what Aldo and Carl were doing from Murmur's side, showing like what was the overview of the landscape looking like. We followed that up with a bit more in-depth digging into the accounts, the narratives, what they were saying, who were saying it, how were they saying it, how were they amplifying it. And then thirdly, we did these in-person interviews as parts of the case studies, shedding some light on behind the scenes, how were they doing what they were doing. While doing this, one of the things that we picked up, and this is on, let me see if I can maybe just refer you, since we don't have slides, just to the pages in the report itself. This starts on page 21. Sorry, 22, I think. Yes, there we go. That's from page 22. What we picked up was that there was a network that was campaigning against the Democratic Alliance. Now, the reason why this specific network was interesting was that out of all the campaigning and the hashtags that we were looking at, most and nearly all of it was positive. These were things like vote EFF, vote ANC, vote MK. There wasn't a lot of campaigning targeting political parties or political opponents in a negative manner, except for this specific one, this anti-DA, anti-Democratic Alliance one that we picked up. A lot of this pivoted off of a website that we identified called the Dumb Alliance website, obviously a play on the Democratic Alliance, Dumb Alliance. And we noticed that this was part of a kind of a cyclical engagement of various influencers. We tracked them back over a period of 3 months. They engaged with, I think we've got about 11 hashtags here that they engaged with over this period. And it was very clear once we put this data onto a timeline, how they congregated. You'd see these spikes in the engagement around these hashtags, which would very quickly ramp up as they started engaging. And once the influencers stopped, it died down very quickly as well. That's often indicative that this is something that's either paid for, it's amplified, there's something coordinated there. It's not organic engagement where a conversation would take a lot longer to taper down. So in addition to these kind of the very spiky hashtags, we also noticed that the accounts engaging with it was influencer-like accounts. So a lot of them had things like paid influencer in the bios. They had mentions of digital marketer or DM for promos, various indicators either on the bios themselves or on their timeline that these are part of an influencer network. These are individuals who will take money to tweet whatever you ask them to. So these two things, the fact that they were engaging with these very specific hashtags, the fact that they were, I think, let me just get my mic back up here. The fact that they were coordinating across a specific time period, and then lastly that these were social and digital marketers, led us to the assumption that this is part of a paid organized network. Now, in terms of, thank you, in terms of what they were trying to get across, this is very awkward to keep talking. There we go. Thanks so much. So we started looking at what they were saying. Now, I've mentioned this Dumb Alliance website. This is quite interesting because the website was a montage of scandals. None of it false. All of these were things that DA councillors, DA politicians were engaged with, which was in some shape or form scandalous. And there was basically a list of 10 of these politicians alongside their scandals. I mean, it's often a case when it comes to, when we talk specifically about disinformation, that whether it's true or false isn't the question. You can use truthful information as part of a disinformation campaign. It's in the way that you distribute it, the way that you disseminate it, that can be an issue. And this was the case here. This website wasn't registered in any way that you could discern who is publishing the site. They used what's known as a privacy proxy, where you can see that the site was registered, but you can't see by who. Another thing was that some of the metadata online was scraped. So you could see one of the videos that they published, there was a 2-minute video of John Steenhuisen, the DA leader, stuttering during interviews. It was, quite humorous to watch. It's the type of thing that gets you engagement on a site. But the metadata of that specific video was scraped for the most part. We couldn't see where it was generated, what tool was used. One thing that did remain in the metadata was the time zone in which that video was created. And that was created in a +3 time zone, GMT +3, which is obviously different from GMT +2, which is South Africa's. So this means that this video was created in a GMT +3 time zone and then uploaded onto a website which was published in South Africa. It doesn't tell us which country specifically, it doesn't tell us exactly who or why or who paid, but it does give an indication there is something untoward going here, alongside the fact that there was the privatized domain itself, alongside the use of paid influencers. All of these things point to that this is a form of inorganic campaigning and inorganic engagement that was going on. Other things that also pointed to the fact that it was coordinated was they actually made a spelling mistake in one of the campaigns where they, instead of spelling it Dumb Alliance, they spelled Damn Alliance with a D-A-M-B. And a lot of the accounts just repeated that without actually engaging and realizing that the link they were sharing was spelled incorrectly. It was likely that they received some kind of a script or perhaps via, I know they coordinate via WhatsApp messages, and just copied and pasted that without realizing that they actually misspelled that link. And then when it comes to like the offline side, this is another aspect that was quite interesting about this, was the offline aspect. So in addition to these online campaigns and these online hashtags and the sharing of the website, they actually put up posters in, and we can at least identify them in Durban, where they put up posters showing DA leaders. It resembled the DA posters. It actually looked remarkably a lot like DA posters, where on the posters there's a QR code. If you scan the code, it'll take you to the Dumb Alliance website. Now these posters were put up in the real world, on posters, on dustbins, on lamp poles, at least in Durban. There was one video where one of the campaigners was walking with a poster with John Steenhuisen dressed as a clown while John Steenhuisen was speaking in the background. So at one of their events, they actually managed to get a protester in there with a poster walking up, and this was also shared. Other things they did was these Vox Pop interviews. So, to be a video where you could see somebody walking up the street and somebody just randomly walks up to this individual and says, "Hi, can you tell me who you're voting for?" And out of the 8 examples that we had, all 8 of them would say, I used to vote DA, but I think I'm going to make a different choice. I'm not voting for the DA this year. I'm giving someone else a chance. So again, having these Vox Pop videos trying to show that there's a shift of support for the DA. Yeah, so this was just one of the case studies. It ties in with some of the other findings, the use of influencers. We couldn't find a direct link that this was part of the campaign that the case study number 2 was actually working on. They didn't want to share that with us. But if you look at the rest of the campaigning being positive, vote for the EFF, vote for the ANC, vote for the MK, versus this one, which was very targeted, very negative, and very specifically targeting the DA. That was something for us that was quite interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen and Jean. We know, yes, the report. I would urge you, if you haven't read it, it's 36 pages, but it's absolutely worth it. But thank you for the sound bites that you were able to give us to start the conversation. I would like to call the rest of our panel, Tabs, Sai, and Josiah, to join us on stage, and of course, Jean and Karen to also join us. There's 5 seats. Thank you. No, not yet. Sorry, Guy. All protocols observed.
I thought there was no one who can say no to that.
I know, I'm saying.
You may sit with it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Tabs, I think because Jean and Karen referred to you a lot, Tabs was the investigative journalist that found some of these influence. So, just shortly, Tabs, who are these influencers? Is it a full-time job? And you also alluded to me earlier that the online personality is fundamentally different from the offline personality. Just in a nutshell for us, please.
Sure. Just finding them and calling them up to set up these interviews was quite a challenge. As I mentioned earlier, it was when I actually have to meet them, because I had formed a picture online, because I have followed them, I have seen their tweets, and I've seen what they're tweeting about. And then when I actually met them, it was completely different. You know, when you have like a picture in your mind, it took a while for me to understand that I'm talking to a real person. I am not talking to the online person who just tweets stuff. I am talking to a person who's got a job. He came, he has businesses. He was in the interview, he was answering phone calls from the workers as well. I actually drove up to Limpopo to meet him, like 5 hours, and it took us 3 hours of just like talking to him. And I got a picture of, for me, what was surprising, it was like how they were intentional about what they're doing. This is actually a job for them. They call it a side hustle. He called it a side hustle of doing it, but he's got a full-time job. He's got a family. He was talking about, his family as well. And then online, it's just like a totally different person. He hides behind that. It's not his real picture. It's not his real name. But yeah, so it was different in that sense.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. And of course, we'll have some Q&A interaction because I don't want to take the floor and ensure that our speakers get as much time to talk about it. Sai, now you, according to my own version, are the epitome of calmness. Watching you on TV, listening to your sound bites during those 72 hours from the election to as the results trickled. Of course, when we had that offline of the IEC, I don't know how you coped, how many cups of coffee you had, but be that as it may. Sai, so this was an election where you had to, and the IEC had to defend misinformation and disinformation. As Karen alluded, you had one of your commissioners coming under severe attack from a new political player. Talk to us and take us into confidence about, what was it like to having to defend this misinformation and disinformation, and how prepared were you for this kind of just attack on such an important institutional body in our country, and of course, lessons learned for as we look to 2026.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and greetings to all. In the lead up to the elections, it was clear, and I think the report did pick this up, that as soon as MK party was formed, there was a clear political program of undermining the integrity of the institution and its processes. What that said to us was a need to increase our internal capacity to deal with this information. And we did, in fact, grow our social media team from about 5 officials to about 25. And coupled that with a PR company that provided 24-hour online monitoring. But there was a marked improvement. I mean, if you look at what the IC could do in 2024 vis-a-vis what they were doing 2021. There was a marked difference. But even so, I think we came woefully short because of the barrage of inaccurate content on social media. So the lesson there is for me twofold. Firstly, propagating election knowledge in a context of a raging political campaign is somewhat counterproductive because you are competing for attention. The moment for us to disseminate that education, ensure that there's that digital literacy and proper facts about the legislative framework for elections, and so it's now when one looks at the 2026 election. Of course, there are financial constraints. Budget comes in the year in which the election, but I think it is our responsibility to engage Treasury to say, your voter education interventions must be happening now and not later on. Now, of course, the technical glitches happened in the most inopportune election. I mean, they should have happened when things were a little bit benign, but things are not benign. Now, here's an issue that we were dealing with. We firstly needed to eliminate certain possibilities in the investigation. Firstly, that we were not, we have not been attacked. That the information has not been compromised, and exclude that, because I think in everybody's mind was there's a cyber attack on the IC systems and so. So even ourselves, we needed to technically be sure that there was no such an occurrence. But that does take time because it's a technical investigation. Because we were wary to go out and make a public claim only to be found that we were wrong. I think the damage would have been greater had we gone out too soon and communicated something that was not correct. But I hear the report that perhaps together with experts and other people, we need to think deeply about, even in that scenario, what's your holding thing that you issue to reassure people rather than keeping quiet and only coming back once you've fully verified the facts. The last point, I know I'm talking a bit too much, and there are many august people in the panel here who need to get a chance to speak. The partnerships with the platforms, especially the framework for cooperation. I don't know what colleagues think, but I think we may not be able to persuade many of them to sign in the manner they did the last time because of the changing social media landscape. So without the benefit of that cooperation framework, we've got to articulate a different approach or a revised approach. Because X will never sign. In fact, more so now than was the case 2 years ago. So we've got to think that. But given the changing social media landscape, we also need to expand the purview of our monitoring capability with the MMA partnership, but also internally with our partnership. And lastly, many institutions are doing good work. fact checkers, Jean and his ilk, we need to have a collaboration and a way of feedbacking with each other. Of course, we're not changing Jan's mandate, but we need to be pulling what he picks up into some kind of central repository and periodically look at that and analyze it to say, what does it say? What does it say about the environment and what changes ought to be made to respond to those types of things? But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sai, for taking us into confidence and sharing us some of the issues that the IEC had to deal with, and also how you see this relationship unfolding as we head to the 2026 elections. So Josiah, thank you so much. Josiah is one of the leads in the Government Communication Network, and you had established an extensive network of government communicators with the help of our very clever data scientists at CSIR to deal with disinformation, information. Josiah, just take us into confidence, kind of, without taking too much time, how you dealt with some of these misinformation, disinformation challenges, but also how quickly were you able to respond? I mean, given that you have limited people and, of course, data scientists as well.
Yeah, sure. And greeting to colleagues this morning. So let me just quickly start here. So in the event of COVID-19, this proliferation of misinformation and disinformation became very apparent. And it was clear that government was not going to win this alone. We went into partnership with civil society, one of them MMA here, Mr. Bed, Africa Check, and it gave us trajectory. We named it a National Communication Partnership. So coming to now the elections, I think the assessment was that even here, we are not going to win as government alone. And we then collated everyone into one room. Law enforcement, IEC, of course, was there. And obviously some partners that we had partnered with, ISS, again, Check Africa. In the main, we wanted a mechanism where we would be able to help each other, just check the environment, but once we have checked the environment, if there's anything untoward, how do we now say, IEC, how do you respond? Obviously, with just this analogy to say, if you have a 100-meter pipe and in between you have maybe a first diameter that says is 3 millimeter, then the second one says 2 millimeter. It speaks to the pressure of information that goes through. So we might say, this is fake, go for it, IEC, only to find that within their protocol and their mechanism, they can't move as fast as we would have requested. So I think an answer to that is perhaps to simulate these kind of things, and I think it's one of the recommendations that came out. To a large extent, if it was just issues about government, we were able to really rise up because already the protocol is quite tight there. For example, we had two anecdotes that I can just give. One was fear-mongering around the collapse of the rand, just on the eve of the elections. We were able, I remember one colleague from the intelligence community calling me to say we need to respond that. We were able to get the minister to do an interview and some other products. Same as load shedding. But when it comes to a bit of law enforcement and IEC, I think in most cases we are found in there. And I think it's one particular aspect that we may need to approve, and we can only approve and if we begin to simulate more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Josiah, because I think, I'm sure as a government communicator, as you say, there's only so much you can do and how you respond and how you carefully chose which one to actually go in. So thank you very much to the panelists for your concise answers, because of course we are opening now 2 questions, both online and of course from the panel. And I will start with you, Professor Guy Berger, with the first question.
Thank you so much, and congratulations to report authors and to the remarks of the people. To the report people, it seems to me that it was perhaps a pity you only looked at those two platforms, because anybody in this game would be going cross-platform, and it would be, I imagine, that you could identify some influencers on X, but then you could immediately go and look at them on TikTok. You don't have to go then to the whole of TikTok. You could just see there. And then I'm interested also that you were very kind to the mainstream media. But there's a certain mainstream media house, which was one of the leading actors in disinformation and attacks on the IEC. And I wonder where they fitted into this overall network, if they were instigating stuff in the network or picking up from the network, or those people. So that's my one question. Very quickly to Sai. I think you're completely right that the platforms won't play ball in the same way. And so then it's a question also taking into account your point about advanced information. You were very shy, if I may say, last year in not making an issue that X refused to give you the time of day. And would it not be a service in digital literacy to tell the public that platforms have been invited, those that agreed, well and good, they get credit, but those that don't agree, you tell the public, because a platform like X, quite clearly Elon Musk will choose to support some political contenders. So it's no longer even a platform, it's an instrument, although people think it's a platform because there's other people on it, but it's completely skewed, not just, as Karen said, it's politically skewed. And we may see the same with some of these other platforms as well, so following on Musk's instrumentalization. So my question to you is, will you try to educate the public so they can be a bit more skeptical about what's going to happen with these platforms?
Thank you very much,
Will you be diplomatic?
Which he is. Thank you so much. Question at the back.
Shawans from the Netherlands Embassy. I know that you looked at X and Facebook, but we know that in South Africa, WhatsApp is the most popular social media platform. Did you find any way through which the influencers connect these different platforms? How do things jump from X and end up in the different WhatsApp channels? The transmission mechanism, are there particular strategies that you've picked up? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll leave it 2 questions for the panel to answer, and then we'll come back, and I've also got some online questions. Thank you so much. Karen, I'll start with you.
Okay, just going to pick up on that last question, actually. WhatsApp's very difficult, obviously all the groups are closed groups, but what we did see was a crossover between X and Facebook. I'm going to give you an example of one of the influencers that we looked at, who was part of a geographic group of entrepreneurs on a Facebook group for a particular region of South Africa that comments on nothing to do with politics. And very, very quickly, that group was used by this particular influencer to inject some doubt about the elections. He was talking about a narrative that the reason why the elections were skewed was because of all the foreign voters, and they were all DA foreign voters voting outside of South Africa, and sort of posited it, hey, what do you guys think? And was basically using that platform to cross-reference other material that had been posted on TikTok, that was pro-NK material on TikTok. So we saw attempts. One of the biggest challenges is it's very labor intensive. So we actually had to look at it manually and look at how those connections were happening manually. But also, I mean, there's a certain amount of spillover from mainstream platforms onto WhatsApp groups and into vernacular. That's another area that we had limited research resource to be able to do. So it is definitely imperfect, but certainly what we were able to see is for benign groups being hijacked, and we'll talk about hashjacking of hashtags as well. You'll see that in the report, of being able to effectively direct a conversation on something that's otherwise election unrelated on a different platform, and to try and change the direction of the conversation. Do you want me to answer one of the other questions at
Yes,
the same time?
please.
Just on the mainstream media point, yes, one of our influencers did actually work for IOL at one point. I presume that's what we're referring to. I'm going to defer to Musa in the next section, Musa Nlovu, who talks about the different types of influence tactics that get used. Because of course, our focus has been on social media, but there's influence can be wielded in other ways. One of them is media ownership. And I think particularly in a South African context, that's interesting. So I'm going to completely duck that question other than to acknowledge its importance. And it is, that media landscape is changing, traditional media landscape is changing quite dramatically. And there's obviously quite a lot of cross-fertilization of journalists who work for. What we didn't see, just to build on your question, we didn't see much evidence of traditional journalists moonlighting as influencers by night. Now, we did see that in a study that we did in Kenya. But Musa will tell us more, I'm sure, in panel 2.
Thank you so much, Jean.
No pressure, my friend.
FYI.
I think that's known as a hospital pass.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the other platforms, what invariably happens, we focused on Facebook and TikTok because that's where you could get data for that macro, Facebook and X, because that's where we could get that data for the macro view. The way that we approach this is that we wanted to get the macro view first, and then dip into that pool that we've generated to see. We didn't want to preempt to go and find conversations and find topics. And that is an issue. I mean, and Guy, you probably know this better than most. Having access to that data is the cornerstone of a lot of this type of work. You need to get the data to be able to do the investigation work. So what however happened is that as we started going through the investigation and doing the research, we picked up a lot of instances that spilled over to other platforms, including TikTok. I mean, some of the videos that we found on X, for example, were literally screen grabbed from TikTok, even after they were removed by TikTok. And I know the ISC had a partnership with TikTok. So the content would be removed very quickly from TikTok, but it would still live on X. And there was no moderation happening there. So you'd have a case of killing the head of the Hydra on one platform, but then just lives on and propagates on another. On the other media side, I mean, I fully agree with your point there. I recall right at the beginning of the elections, the same media house had this report on I think it was a market research firm that was doing polling around the elections. And I mean, they predicted a EFF blowout in the Western Cape. And if you actually started looking at the company, this polling company that was making these predictions, they were incubated in the Sekunjalo house on the waterfront. And they were actually based in the same building as the media house publishing the story about it. So it's very clear that these things weren't disclosed. You needed to do some digging to find that. And I think especially in this election, polling seemed to have been a tool of influence. There was a lot of new polling organizations that came across, predicting, one weird election result, to the next. It was clear that there was something around pollsters knowing that what they say influences the way that people act and vote during an election cycle. And then, on the issue of WhatsApp, I mean, WhatsApp is kind of an Achilles heel to the type of work that we do. Firstly, it's encrypted, so end-to-end encryption takes place on there. There's no way to intercept or have an API. Not even the people at WhatsApp know what's going on in conversations between different users. This is slightly different on public groups, but you still need to become a member of that group first. And for the type of research that we did, there's ethical concerns about joining a group. You're not sure what their affiliations are. You don't want to be seen as monitoring the conversations of regular South Africans around their election preferences. There's a lot of ethical, landmines when it comes to joining and observing groups like these. It's not a new phenomenon either. I was in a very weird position in about 2018 where I was invited to a WhatsApp group. There was an individual that I reached out to comment when I was still at News 24. So they had my number, and they ended up inviting me to a WhatsApp group on which they were coordinating social media activity. They were literally providing posts. Listen, here's my post. Here's a link to my post. Please go and like and share it. And this evening at 6 o'clock, we'll be using the following hashtags. Please go and amplify it as it comes along. So it's not new. It's definitely done back then, and it's still being done now. I think the concern is around how do you ethically monitor and investigate something like that without necessarily being, wiretapping or listening in on conversations of people who are just expressing their constitutional rights.
Thank you, John. Sai, as Guy said, we need to see a more, aggressive IEC perhaps when it comes to engagement with some of these entities.
Yes, I think the overt political posture of some of the platforms does require that the IEC takes a very firm stand in terms of telling the public about their cooperation or otherwise where that does not happen. Of course, when you are in an institution like the IEC, there are constraints that the institution has, because you still need to cooperate, even at some future point. So it is therefore important that even in your condemnatory message, you do not preclude possibility for future cooperation. But to answer Professor Beggar's questions directly, we think that on this occasion, given the types of changes that have happened and the political posturing, it may be opposite to tell the public.
Thank you so much. Some insights from you, Tabs?
Okay, in terms of...
Or an added comment?
Oh, all right. I think in terms of as Professor Becker said, in terms of the media, because I'm also in my other hat, part of the media as well. But what is encouraging is that it was now, during the elections, people were not rushing to publish first, or if they were not in competition. I think that added a lot of fact-checking and basically just making sure that whatever that was trending, so it was not more, they see a hashtag trending, they investigated and fact-checked and then published. And they worked together with other organizations as well. So I think that was encouraging, given the pressure in the media, what is going on in the industry as well, with journalists and being the first. So this time around, I think they did take a step back and not follow what was trending or the trends. So I think that was yeah.
Josiah, a last point from you?
Yeah. So I think for us, the runaround was really around WhatsApp. And because as GCIS, we do have this network that goes through a level of even the communities, then our communication officers will, for some time, be able to pick up this misinformation or products that intend to manipulate people. But you do see that they're not necessarily in the mainstream, but they seem to be bubbling under. It's only because we have this network with communities that we are able to pick them up, but it equally becomes quite challenging for you to begin to correct them because you don't necessarily know where this network are residing and who's perpetuating them. But we do see that WhatsApp is quite problematic. Yeah.
Okay. I don't have the answers, but thank you for sharing that. I have a question from Edith Mwalokasa online. And I think, Sai, this is a question for you, perhaps. Is deepfake a criminal offense or an election offense? So that's one question. Madam, I will go to you because you had your hand up, and then also William, and then you.
Thank you very much for that input, and I think the report is also quite exciting. I'll try to minimize my questions to two. My name is Nomshado Lubisa, and I'm from Code for Africa. So, from an African perspective and context, digital manipulation has always been kind of trail-lined to what's happening within Western countries. So the usage of Photoshops, deepfakes, and so forth. But I think as years are going by, we're starting to actually see that context is the catalyst here. And hence influences and influencing sets of styles of communication is winning in this. So my question is really around the offline cultural trust, because that's what makes influencers kind of sit in the position of power dynamics that they are in currently right now, because that dynamic is in a completely different light. So yes, deepfakes are working. Yes, photoshopped images rather, and all these digital manipulations are really coming to about. But within Africa, influence is a different style. It's all about trust. And hence, even media trust comes into about, because now you get societies would rather go to their favorite influencer for information than a media outlet. Why is that? Are we probing more questions into actually getting into the depth of that offline cultural trust that maybe we are missing? So it's a big question, but I think the report is really pushing us and propelling us to start looking at that. The other question I have is around the central repository. What I find exciting about South Africa is slowly but surely we've been coming together as organizations and institutions to try and really kind of centralize our efforts, because reality is we all work in silos and in different forms. Some are looking for perpetrators, some are looking for research behind the style of mis and disinformation, some are following the money, for example, like Code for Africa. But this central repository has always been kind of targeted for time frame of mitigation, because we come together, but it's too late. And the big question is, what is the outcome that's supposed to come from that? What is the key urgent outcome that's supposed to come from that? Because reality is, once it's happening, it's very difficult to nip it in the bud. But how do we do the pre-mechanisms? I'm more interested in that. And I feel like that's what this type of research is propelling us to really start putting in place. What is the pre-mechanisms, or what are rather the pre-mechanisms that can actually start to be put in place to ensure that that time frame is not targeted, or that time frame is not utilized by influencers, because they're also working behind the scenes. Those that are giving or pouring money in, I have already prepared by now for the next election period. How can we actually also be ahead?
Okay, thank you for that. William?
Thanks, and thanks for the excellent reports and excellent input so far. I just want to ask, that move from online to real life thing seems to be a lot more like a traditional branding, marketing, activation entity. And I'm wondering if you're finding evidence of these kind of full suite service entities that are saying, we'll do this for clear political ends. Because if that is the case, then we should be able to identify who these actors are. And if that is the case, we then should be able to, as the IEC, should be able to then identify and pull them in to that elections regulation rubric, which requires them to adhere to particular ethical standards. And then, so I'm interested if you've got an idea of that. And then on IOL, the thing to point out is that, of course, that one of the big distinguishing features of them is that they're no longer part of the press council. At the time they were carrying out their horrific reporting in their elections, they were still there, and then they attacked anyone that was critical of them, including ourselves on a number of levels. And I guess the response is, as media that do belong to these things, and as government and as public institutions, what role can you play in highlighting credible media that do belong to credible entities like the Press Council? Thanks.
Thanks. William?
Thanks, everyone. So just based on my work with the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change, our interest lies in how do we bring public interest messaging into the 21st century. So, Sai, I think it speaks to what you addressed and what Nomshado touched on also regarding the pre-mechanisms. And so maybe this is a question for you, and then with some support from the data analytics guys. So voter education should happen, which I think we all agree on. There's a lack of civics education in the country, which the recent expropriation bill and all the misinformation around that has just clearly pointed out. But we're also in a state of information overload. So if we create interventions, say a year in advance before the next 2026 by-elections, the social media landscape would have shifted, and new tactics are at play, and perhaps people would have forgotten the training that they've received. So my question is, do we understand what kind of further interventions are required post-digital literacy? In terms of, is there a certain level, a certain critical mass of information that the government and other institutions also have to start putting out onto digital platforms in order to mitigate or reduce the impact of what the maligned actors are pushing out also? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 10 minutes until coffee, so I'm going to give 2 minutes to each panelist and try to summarize, not easy, some of the key issues raised by our last round of questions. I think, unfortunately, each question alone is about 10 minutes. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do that. It's the nature of having to moderate, that you're trying to get the best out of people. And of course, in that few minutes of coffee, you will be able to engage, and then later on. Karen, I'll start with you to summarize some of the answers from the questions that we've had in this last round.
Yeah, I'll be a bit selective if that's okay, but I think Shadow made a really good point about sort of the cultural trust issues. And I think my gut tells me that, you're absolutely right, and we need to engage who are the offline messages, who are those trust, and those trust actors include politicians, like them or loathe them. And so, but there may also be community leaders, there may be religious leaders. Those, for me, are an audience that needs to be targeted, if you like, to understand the consequences and to be much, much more engaged in ensuring why the value of clear, verifiable information, why that is a valuable article in its own right. So I think it's identifying who those trust messengers are and working with them quite closely to understand that online, offline sentiment. I say this at nearly every event like this. I know we often get criticised for putting the onus on the receiver of the information, but I think it's very, very difficult. It's almost, given the current regulatory environment in terms of being able to slap the hands of the social media. There's some research that indicates that even if people know that what they're looking at is incorrect, it is misinformation, it's disinformation, if it's fun, it still gets distributed. And I'm looking at Professor Wasserman, who guided me towards this, because I think it's quite interesting, and there needs to be a program in terms of pre-training and pre-preparation for events with this changing landscape, to make individuals aware. Why be a purveyor of incorrect information or understanding the consequences? I talk about this campaign, don't be a useful idiot. If I'm a young, hip 18-year-old, I don't want to be an idiot. I don't want to be someone else's patsy. And therefore, a carefully crafted campaign to understand not about what's fake news and what's not fake news, but how are you playing into this bigger information ecosystem, and how is your feed being utilized? I think would have quite a significant impact. It has to happen early on. Ghana, I have to say, was pretty much ahead in the elections in terms of some of their digital awareness that happened in the months leading up to it. But I think a wholesale campaign, not just during election time, but just in schools, in universities, in communities, to try and provide some understanding that, you know, when you are sharing some content, it's not just about, it has a real world impact. I think that is a kind of wholesale approach that we need to consider, because I think, you know, if evidence is correct that people share stuff regardless without understanding the impact, then we need to make the messaging much more clearly. This is what it means in real terms. And if you value your democracy, you need to understand you're not going to be someone else's puppet.
Thank you for that. Jean?
Yeah, I think the big issue, as Corin pointed out, is that, you know, the fake news stuff is interesting. It's, you know, it's the kind of thing that makes you go, wow, and, you know, I need to go and show this to someone. I can't be the only person that knows about this. And when you eventually come with a debunk, you know, when Africa Check comes around and they, you know, come with this is what the actual fact is, that's boring. Nobody wants to be that party pooper that comes around with, you know, well, actually, this is what the facts are. And that's a recurring problem that you'll kind of always face when it comes to dealing with these type of influence operations. And to Josabel's point, you know, if you can try and put out that critical mass, but at the end of the day, you're vying for a limited amount of attention. The way that the internet and the algorithms and social media platforms have set us up, creating content is cheap and easy. Between Gen AI and Photoshop and, you know, the fact that you can do a lot of this on your smartphone, you know, creating content is cheap and easy. Distributing that is cheap and easy because you've got platforms that will basically do that for you, because that's how they make their own money, which means the constraining factor now is the audience's attention. And they are faced with a barrage of interesting stuff. They are faced with reels. They've got 30-second TikToks that, you know, take up 2 hours of your day if you add up all of them together. There's lots of things that are vying for the attention of users, and trying to get truthful, concrete, solid information out there on something as important as voting is, I think that's where the challenge lies, is getting that through. William, on your point about the branding and whether that looks and smells like a activation, it does. There wasn't any evidence that we could find concretely that would allow us to put that into the report. But the fact that it was happening both online and offline with consistency, somebody paid for posters, somebody put those posters up there, somebody paid for interviews and equipment to go and do interviews in public. So there had to be something like that. There wasn't anything that we could find in the open source that would corroborate or confirm that, though. It was more sophisticated than a lot of the influencer campaigns, which is just something that occurs and happens online. And then I think maybe lastly, and this is, see Crystal is looking at me, on Nomshana's point about, you know, having, I mean, there are at least 8 non-government, 9 if you count the media organizations in this room who are approaching and looking at this problem, just in this room now. And I think finding ways for all of us to coordinate better, to look at the same thing through the lens of our strengths. I mean, the CIBC is good at doing counter messaging. You've got Media Monitoring Africa that's got their fingers in so many pies. They know exactly what's going on where in this information ecosystem. You've got Code for Africa with their massive regional footprint. There's a lot of strengths and weaknesses that each of us have, and finding a way to coordinate that now, not when the next election cycle comes around, because by then we need to be ready to deal with this head on. We saw a lot of activity at the start of the year last year, because it was an election year, people organizing, people getting together. But we need to find a way of carrying that momentum now with the eye on 2026, not only trying to do this once 2026 comes around. Because while we're still thinking about this, still planning, still, you know, trying to see how we'll be doing this, the influencers they've already got their network set up. They're already ahead of us in this game.
Sai, there you have it. There's a room of people willing to hold your hand. But just concluding remarks, please.
Yeah, just 2 points quickly. What message should we be taking out there, education-wise, at the moment? It's not that how to mark your ballot correctly. That's not the issue. But things like how do we calculate seats in a municipal council? We found that that seat calculation was a terrain for malfeasance. And because it's a technical subject, so we need to find resources to articulate it clearly in simple terms and ensure that members of the public understand it. As an example, I mean, there are other examples. And then the question about the electoral code of conduct and whether deepfakes and offense. You see, in law, the electoral code of conduct takes effect on the date on which the date of the election is proclaimed. And there's a rationale for that, because the electoral code of conduct proscribes some of the rights of people. So you want to limit that period as much as possible. Now, once the electoral code of conduct takes effect, there are certain offenses which are criminal in nature, which can be reported to the SAPS, investigated, and so on. Now, the difficulty is this. The judicial system does not treat electoral offenses with the necessary urgency, and they don't take them serious. I suppose if you have a docket for rape, murder, and electoral offense, you're going to prioritize. And it means, therefore, we need to be engaging more with the NPA and the justice system to ensure that, to conscientize really, that, you know, if we don't deal with these cases as quickly as we should and with seriousness, then we creating conditions where these things happen and people feel that they can get away with them. I think I wanna leave it at that, and I think we have opportunities to have a coordinated approach within each one's mandate.
I'll go to you, Josiah, as I think it would link nicely to what the IEC has just said.
Yeah, maybe just to say, and I'm probably going to be sharing too much here. So the medium-term development plan that is being worked on, the one around GCPS, which is a cluster responsible for our safety and security and general stability across the country. They have now, out of the 4 outcomes, one that specifically deals with cybersecurity. I think for us, it says 2 things. There's going to be political will. Then the second one is to say that because it's an outcome, and I think scholars of strategy will back me up here, when they say once it's an outcome, it requires different players to come on board, which means, I think, responding to the issue of the central repository, we are then able to say, player X, player agency X, your contribution is this much. In terms of the repository, what is it that you can contribute? And I think for us, in a bigger scale and looking at long term, I think it will begin to unlock quite a number of things, including the digital literacy, because it does require a certain amount of resources. For now, we do have one, but you look at the margins of what is being put there, yeah, you can't really do much.
Okay, thank you for that honesty, honest answer, Josiah. But I'm sure there's other questions from the audience that you can answer during the coffee break. A last 1 minute to you, Tabs, on some concluding remarks.
Sure, 1 minute. So when I was doing the interviews, and then one of the influencers said to me, if there is a fire that's happening right now, and a member of the public takes a picture, who do you think they're going to send that picture? Is it me as an influencer, or is it a traditional media house? And how will that picture circulate? and I couldn't answer him. So there's a lot of work that we need to do, because as well it has to do with trust. We must remember that the influencers have positioned themselves, hence they are now in a market where people approach them because they are talking about conversations that are happening in our communities, people, subjects that people care about. So when people hear something, they first want to go to the influencer to see what their opinion is. They even solicit their opinion on various topics. So I feel like we're doing like Operation Catch Up. There's a lot that we still need to do. And I do think that digital and media literacy on the influencers themselves, because they truly believe what they're doing is a service to the public. They truly believe that they would ask you like, but I'm practicing my freedom of speech. What is it that I did wrong? And I'm like, firstly, you're using a fake name, you're using a fake picture, you're saying something that is not verifiable. But to them, again, it's like, am I breaking any law? Even when I talk to my nieces and nephews who are 18 and were first-time voters, they would ask me, what is he doing wrong? Like, how can you say that it is wrong? And then, because they position themselves in that sense. So we also need now not only to catch up, but to be ahead of the curve.
Being ahead of the curve. Thank you so much, Fonte, and to the panel for your insights. This was a teaser. There's many more discussions, I'm sure, and we'll have some of them during tea. But last words from ISS Director Fonte.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the panelists as well. A couple of things. The first observation is I think the panel has raised the issue of interventions need to take place at different levels. And for interventions to take place at different levels, the credibility of our institutions matter. So how do we work towards strengthening the credibility of governance institutions across the board? The second is that credibility is the cornerstone of trust, the way trust is structured within society and what trust delivers as an outcome of political processes. The third point is that information fits in within a set of material conditions. So the material conditions of the environment equally matter as well, and we have to take all of these together. Jean raised the important issue about the groups that are gathered in this room. The ISS commits, in fact, to organizing an annual convening around issues of disinformation and misinformation as it affects political processes, not just in South Africa, but also bringing examples from the rest of the continent. So we hope that the groups present would be willing and able to join us in these convenings annually, which would actually be taking place in Cape Town as well. So we will be here again next year and the year after. We've got to build traction and see exactly how we have improved in these conversations. And we hope that you would bring your experiences as well to enrich these conversations. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. So just some housekeeping. We'll have a 10-minute break. For our online viewers, we'll pause and then we'll get ready for panel 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I hope you had a great tea and able to network and be amongst friends. William, I thank you for joining me, and then we're just waiting for William. Oh, sorry, for Herman. Does anybody know where Herman disappeared to? Okay. Okay. Is there a reason why? Okay. No? Okay. Am I? Because it's on silent. Just need a timekeeper. Here he is. Thank you, Herman. Is it my phone? Or what? Is it this? Hi, everyone. Thank you for the very interesting questions from you. Thank you to the panelists, really very insightful. And I do think this should be required reading for those of us in the field, and it should be distributed to all media houses, the few media houses that are still around. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome panel 2. A series of experts from Aldo who's worked on the report, to Herman who's done some pivotal work around looking at this issue in terms of the broader scheme. William, of course, the 411, and to talk us more about that specific program, and then Musa, who's going to give us insights into what's happening in our newsrooms and the connection. So this second panel will look at the lessons learned for South Africa, but also the wider region. What's happening in East Africa, what's happening in West Africa, and of course the global connections. We also want to look at, as our panel alluded, the future of some of these influence campaigns, the influence of AI, and just the absolute speed that we see how this is happening. And of course, South Africa, we're in the spotlight. It's the G20 presidency, but we've also become the target of all things MAGA movement in the US. So that will be our discussion, and we hope for some concise input, and then of course an absolute engagement with our audience here. And I would like to also welcome my old sister from another life, which is Dudu, and why I'm taking her out, because she actually comes and she made the time to join us, and she's from TikTok. And so I do hope to bring her into some of the discussions. But I will start straight with Aldo, because Aldo, you were part of that Murmur team. You were providing the kind of data analytics. Talk to us about the interconnectedness of influences from South Africa to Kenya to other parts of the world. Talk to us about some of these connections that you found. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. So I think the way to look at these networks is it's essentially a little cottage industry that's been developing over quite a while. It started more with brand work. People would just promote brands, be the classical influencer. When we talk to media normally, and we talk about the role of influencers in politics, they immediately think, Kim Kardashian, that type of influencer. We always have to bring them back to no. These are influencers that they're not celebrities necessarily. They have some niche. They've got some form of trust, which I love. I love that distinction in segment in the market. And they saw that they can commodify this, and they commodified it on smaller scale, and more they're creating little agencies, let's call them WhatsApp agencies, where they coordinate and plan, and this is not my type of gig, but this might be yours, or I'm a bit hot at this moment, let you take that one. So we see that operating in country. But then we also see that across Africa, it's very much there, and it also always links back to why, when we look at data, we focus across the board. We try to collect everything we can, but we generally always find Twitter or X to still be very informative, because we consider that the digital public square. It's very performative. People, you don't trust what people say on this platform, but it's very telling about, you know, what people are interested in, how people are trying to manipulate the market, or manipulate a strong word, but how they try to influence perspectives on people, things, you know, places, brands, political parties, you know, all of that. So then what we do see, which is wasn't necessarily part of this study, but we saw the implication of that in the study is that there are, let's call them higher up groups operating on a geopolitical scale that are very good at utilizing these local little markets of influencers to try to change the perception of certain geopolitical entities. And gone are the days where you try to tell a country straight, you know, from your influencer into their context, this is what we think you should think. They're now using local narratives, local people, local trusted entities that are out to make a buck. I think, oh, this is fairly innocent to retweet this or run this campaign or jump on this hashtag. And then at the same time, they run this, let's call it the fires of chaos, to keep all of the fact-checking and everyone very busy, trying to find, you know, where did someone lie, where's fake news, where's misinformation, where's disinformation. Meanwhile, you've got these well-trusted local influencers, you know, generating content, you know, changing narratives, linking geopolitical stuff back to local issues and framing issues in that way. And I think that's where this network, it really is now running into Africa. And one small interesting thing, we did a study with Herman. It's not published or anything. It's very fresh. I don't know if you looked at it. But the third largest influencer in the Namibian elections, now granted Namibia is not very massive, is a South African influencer. I think he's actually Zimbabwean, but he was the biggest, and that's and it's very central. If you look at the network in this report, we did a similar network for Namibia, and you'll see very central, dominated the narratives. That campaign decided what Namibia will talk about online. You know, whether it's successful is a different question, but that's. They keep everyone busy on their talking points, and that's a everyday influencer that Tab spoke to, you know. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that insights, Aldo. Herman, so I'm coming to you now as a follow-up and as a thread. You, of course, did a very interesting study that gave us some nuanced pointers on the geopolitical influence and the nature of that campaign. Talk to us just briefly on, for those that of our audience who might not have had sight of your study, talk to us briefly about that, but also talk to us about the geopolitics of influence campaigns. Does it really sway people? And, you know, what is actually then put on social media platforms?
Okay, so I think let me first deal with the study that we did. So I worked with Aldo and Kyle at Murmur, and we looked at, you know, potentially it was interesting to look at what is the influence of Russia and China particularly, because they have also been influential in the African broader media space for a while, and this has now moved on to social media as well. So it's difficult not to repeat anything that people have said already. I mean, these networks are working and they're operating, usually small local influencers amplifying and repeating what is there. I think the question is more maybe. So maybe let me firstly say, with that we found quite a number of accounts, a big number of accounts that are so-called buzzers, that they, as a term from Indonesian politics, where local influencers amplify and repeat and sort of buzz out a message. And a lot of that had to do with inserting Russian talking points around the aggression towards Ukraine, the typical sort of themes and narratives around Russia, supposed self-defense, their family values, their pro-Palestine stance. Basically, they tap onto whatever narrative they can find that might give them some traction. Okay? But I think the interesting point, and we reported on this as a report on this in the Daily Maverick, where we outlined this, and I'm happy to take more detailed questions about that. But I think your question about how does this influence, and this also comes back to what Aldous just said, how does this influence behavior and voter behavior? And that sort of is an old, long-standing question in media studies, even long before social media, is how do people respond to the messaging? And the point, I think, is that this is not a magic bullet. This is not a direct causal influence that, you know, somebody reads something and then immediately changes their view and they go vote something different. It's more to do with how does it shape the political discourse? How does it change the political communication landscape? And the old terms for this is agenda setting. So not to change people in a robotic way, to change the way that they think, but the way or things that they think about. So setting an agenda to say, these are the things that you should be concerned about. These are the sort of things that you should be paying attention to. And in that regard, these new narratives shape the narrative around particular talking points then that Russia has. And that it also then taps onto local concerns, like xenophobia, for instance, like an anti-establishment point of view. And this could be from the EFF, MK faction, all the way to more conservative Afrikaner communities that are also disillusioned and that are also anti-establishment for very different reasons. So the aim with this is to create, as Aldous said, create chaos, create disruption, create uncertainty, because once you have that sort of cloud cover, or that's the sort of fog, then under the radar you can do all sorts of other things and you can amplify your message. So that, I think that is important to notice. This is why this is happening. It's not necessarily a direct pulling of strings, but it is creating an atmosphere. And I think this is also important in the case, as we've been talking about what to do and how to prepare for the next elections, is that we have to understand that this political communication landscape and atmosphere has changed. And this is a feature increasingly internationally. My colleague Sahana Adupa has written about this in India, for instance. Talks about shadow politics, the shadow politics. And it's not only done by nefarious actors, Russia and China and wherever, it's increasingly becoming a feature of mainstream political campaigns as well, that there's this sort of overt campaigning and political communication, and there's stuff happening under the radar. So I think this is why we should pay attention to this and to think about how does this fog, this disruption, this chaos that is created, what does it tap onto? In our case, it taps onto things like xenophobia, for instance, so we also have to be very careful around those sort of narratives. So not only debunking factually these messages, but also thinking, well, what are the conditions that enable these messages? So something like xenophobia creates the conditions for people then to latch onto it and to slip in other sort of narratives. So it's the landscape of political communication has changed. Political discourse is important to look at. What are the things that people talk about? What are the things that they are concerned, and address them at that sort of very basic, fundamental level, rather than doing this sort of whack-a-mole, I think, of just trying to debunk particular bits of information.
Thank you, Herman. William, we've heard now the landscape is fast changing, different issues arising, but just talk to us, let's go back to the Real 411 platform, where you basically had social medias calling out disinformation and misinformation. Just give us some insights as to how the platform worked. What did you find? And of course, as we look to 2026 and the ever-changing and fast-changing landscape, what are some of the lessons learned and that we're going to see you and your organization and other partners will have to be very fast in terms of how this landscape is changing?
Thanks. So, I mean, Real 411 is essentially a public complaints platform that in many respects is able to act as an early warning indicator for some of the other mechanisms, because it relies on ordinary members of the public to report content that they see. And then that can alert you to something that may be coming from either on, and it can be on whatever social media platform you find it on, including WhatsApp or TikTok or Telegram or websites or whatever. And what we see was increased use of the platform, but what was really very pleasing for us was that more than half of the complaints that were submitted were actually found to be a violation of. So there were instances where it was actually mis or disinformation, for example, as opposed to when in previous years we found that a lot of people would report something and it would tend to be politically something they didn't like, but it wasn't necessarily mis or disinformation. And that to us suggests that people's level of understanding of what is mis and disinformation has actually increased significantly over the last couple of years, and that's quite an important thing. Another key trend that we've noticed is that, of course, these things remain along deeply gendered lines, and that's a kind of consistent feature. It's not a surprise that, or it's not certainly unintentional, it's very deliberate, that it tends to be the women that are targeted in these institutions. Commissioner Janet Love being a central target of the IEC. We see women journalists particularly targeted for not just mis and disinformation, but deliberate bullying and harassment. And the thing is, a lot of the kind of forms of these things are that they aren't so bad that they breach the community guidelines of the various platforms. They're usually done by people that are clever enough to know where those lines lie, so that even if you report it to the platform, they're unlikely to act against it because it doesn't quite meet the threshold for hate speech or incitement to violence or directly conflict with their mis and disinformation policy, those that still have one. I noticed Metis has already changed since then. The experience of the platforms, or those that were part of the cooperation, the framework of cooperation, was actually pretty good to the extent that we interacted and engaged with them. They did do a lot more than they did in the previous elections, which was pretty close to smiling and waving and having a picture taken with some members of the IEC, which ironically was used as a piece of disinformation. They were saying how close the IEC is to these people and all sorts of things. But of course, some of the biggest challenges, and these were reported on extensively in Guy, and then Campaign for Freedom of Expression, and some others. Legal, thank you, I was thinking of IJR, but its Legal Resource Centre actually took complaints to the information regulator eventually to try and force them to divulge the kind of data that they are actually getting in. So to the extent that they cooperate publicly and with us around specific complaints, they were actually a lot more responsive than they have been historically. And certainly they're more responsive than, for example, an entity like IOL, which has now left the Press Council and just seems to do whatever the hell they think. They're a lot like Elon Musk in that regard. And we have to, I think the challenge for us for the next elections is going to be to say what are our responses going to be to deal with those actors and those powerful entities who refuse to abide even by self-regulatory or co-regulatory mechanisms, or even just pretend that they fall outside of any of our regulatory mechanisms. X claims they've got there's no method of accountability currently for them within our jurisdiction, and that obviously is a very real problem. In terms of the answers to those things, I mean, we've spoken a lot about them, continually building trust. I think the political parties and MK in particular have a lot to answer for about how they were so intentional and deliberate about undermining the credibility of the IEC. That clearly is a very real problem, accusing them of all sorts of things and not once providing any kind of evidence. And we've seen that playing out in the judicial system, where they said the elections were rigged. They said they were going to court, then they went to court and they had no evidence, and their case was effectively, then when they were presented with that, I think they wanted to withdraw, and the IEC said, no, you've made this, you need to actually take this through so that the public can gain some level of clarity one way or the other. And again, that's one of the very significant techniques that we're seeing, where it's not just using the law to bolster the case, it's kind of almost abusing legal process. And what we're seeing broadly is our democratic systems aren't equipped for this kind of, these techniques. And we're very lucky in South Africa that our judiciary is independent and properly functioning, and that we've got a strong functioning civil society and a strong functioning media system. And when you look to our neighboring countries, that's very often not the case. And whatever systems we do have and institutions we do have, by and large, they're not appropriately equipped to deal with these things. Government by its nature is not a fast-moving animal, right? It can't be, it shouldn't be for many, many reasons. And yet these things require them to be able to say at a moment's notice, yes or no, this is or isn't the case, etc., and to challenge it. So that court case that was from many, many months ago still has yet to be resolved, right? But those allegations they made, they float around and they undermine credibility and trust. And so what we need for 2026, and I agree with the things that have been said, is many of the programs that we need to be implemented from today. And if not today, then from tomorrow. Because if we don't, we're going to be facing the same kind of deluge. The problem there, of course, is that the resources to combat these things are undermined. We saw the IEC's funding ahead of the elections being cut significantly. So you've got the critical body that's responsible for doing these things having their budgets cut, and that's obviously a very real problem. And we know objectively outside of that that our mainstream media are facing a classic crisis of existence. The SABC barely able to function. We don't know to what extent it'll be an operating concern by the time we get to 2026. And that's the one that the majority of people in our country rely on for their news and information. So all of these things are providing a perfect cluster storm, a cluster poo, or a cluster musk, I suppose you could say, of challenges.
Thank you for that, William. I think also if we look at just the MK's case against the SABC of the using the term GNU was so opportunistic. Again, the little resources that the SABC has as a mainstream organization had to be used to fight this case. But of course, MK had a bigger agenda. So Musa, which brings us to you now. I mean, you obviously study the mainstream media. We heard from William, firstly, the SABC, perfect storm. We don't know where they will be 2026. I think, but on that, the SABC always somehow pulls through miraculously for an election. But we also have independent newspapers, and as we heard from William, they simply just do their own thing. And we talk about independent because, of course, it has a big, partner who owns part of that group, outside country, which you can talk to us about. Talk to us about your observations of trends that you see, not only in South Africa, but in other parts of Africa.
Thank you so much. There is competition first between the media of the countries of the global south and the media of the global north. And what has been happening is the study of China trying to act as a counter-hegemony to the media of the global north, and Russia as well. What has not been studied much is the competition that is also between the countries of the global south themselves. The competition between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar in the continent in terms of media, the competition between Turkey and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the competition between those countries in the Middle East themselves. So there is the competition between, say, the Asian countries, India and China as much as they're part of the BRICS. India is not very big in the continent in terms of transnational media as China is. You know, there is that channel there, etc., but that is meant for the Indian people in the diaspora. China clearly targets Africans in the continent in various countries. It's got programs that are tailored for them, etc., etc. It works kind of overtly in terms of doing that kind of influence. What happens, you know, in other spaces online, colleagues have spoken about that. But if I were to move from Asia to the Middle East and take you to 2015, the WikiLeaks, and what they revealed about how an ambassador of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in Senegal was speaking about increasing subscription to Le Soleil, the newspaper, from 4,000 to 10,000. That is meant for influence. And there is, you know, Senegal is strategically positioned in the continent, and that is also in competition with Iran. That's just one. If you were to go to Hausa TV, for example, which I don't think many people here watch, it's a religious channel sponsored by Iran, and in that channel you will find the voice of Iran. Google now and then blocks it, and then it pops out now and then. And if you go to the Iranian transnational channel, Press TV, and other statements, they complain about how Google, without notice, blocked our channel. So what I'm trying to say is that there is an indirect and direct sponsorship of media platforms in other countries by countries that are outside of the continent, while they themselves are competing for the Middle Eastern regional superiority. So the battles that are outside of the continent are playing themselves in the continent, not only in terms of building military bases, not only in terms of building mosques, not in terms of sponsoring certain cultural programs and certain kinds of humanitarian aid, but also in the media space where you're trying to shape, you know, hearts and minds of Africans. If you look at what happened in September last year with the podcasts, which a number of them are popping up in the continent, the former Secretary of State, American Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken, you know, spoke directly about how the African Stream, which presented itself as a pan-Africanist podcast targeting Africans in the continent and in the diaspora, Blinken said it is actually an extension of Russia today. And then it was closed by Google and Meta and everybody else. What I am trying to say is that the battle is not only in terms of ideological content, but also in terms of the infrastructure. You close the Iranian sponsored TV there using American-owned Google, you close that, but all of these forms of, you know, contents that are owned either in Asia, in the Middle East, pop up in the continent, and they are sponsored by certain governments. And as colleagues have said here, there are young people of particular ideological orientations who will be targeted, be paid, you know, be sponsored to men, for lack of a better word, those particular platforms. So that is the influence outside of what is happening in what is happening online, which aims to talk to people who are between the traditional media spaces. The other method or tactic that governments outside of the continent are following it, they realize that people in South African townships and the villages somewhere else are not going to pick up their remote controls and tune into their international channels. So what they're trying to do is actually form relationships with national broadcasters in various countries, because people do watch national broadcasters. So to form relationships there, and also to kind of subtle pressure journalists to also not only pick up content from other news agencies, but from them as well. I also want to point out something that people may not have paid attention to in South Africa. When Russia invaded Ukraine or had a special operations, depending where you sit, the feed for Russia Today to DSTV was blocked. But immediately, Russia Today came back to South Africa via Starsat, which Starsat had just recently lost its license, but story for another day. But it came back as two channels, as both Russia Today in English and Russia Today in the French language. At the same time, Russia Today was opening offices in Nigeria. At the same time, it was negotiating with governments in West Africa to open, to just open up the broadcasting environment there for Russia. I'm sure you have seen what is happening in West Africa with the governments there getting rid of France and being aligned with Russia. There's no causal relationship, but the coincidence, speaks to that. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are governments outside of the continent that are helping people in the continent open up podcasts and other communicative platforms. And the content of that tend to favor certain narratives. And that is something that is happening. And what I'm trying to say second is that because it tends to be the West that owns the infrastructure of the platforms, they close them down and then they pop up. These platforms are on your Facebook or Meta, they're on Instagram, etc., etc. So that is happening. Lastly, what we are not necessarily also looking at is what is happening outside of the English language. It's pretty much inconsistent what independent media or Segunjalo tends to write. It's not a strong one kind of Fox News type of narrative. Sometimes they will pick up a story which will be positive about people, but sometimes maybe that's how propaganda works. But they will have negative stories about MK, but they will largely have stories that will be supportive of their worldview. I think I'm going to step there, but it's very inconsistent, at least outside of the mainstream English language. So those are some of the things that I've observed. Yeah.
Thanks, Musa. And I'm sure Ukosi FM with its 7.2 million listeners is a key point of information and perhaps also disinformation, but because it's in isiZulu, we won't actually know. I'm going to take the opportunity as moderator to ask Dudu a short input, and the reason I'm doing it with her permission is that she is from TikTok, and I don't think it's every day that we actually have a platform in the room, and at the moment TikTok is the most popular platform in South Africa. Dudu, without, all protocols observed, but share with us or give us some insight. I mean, you've heard how, the disinformation that's happening, the challenges that, you raise issues around disinformation with platforms, the turnaround time. We see Meta, completely distancing itself now from fact checkers. But just take us into confidence, Dudu, and share with us just some of the issues as a platform that you face with, and also the realities for an organization as huge as yours in South Africa and in Africa as well.
Thank you so much. To start with disinformation, I think everybody...
Can you understand, please? Thank you.
I hope you can see me now. To talk about disinformation, I think the challenge for us as researchers will know, when something like that is reported on the platform, it needs investigation. We need to see the patterns. We need to follow. It's not something that we can say, for example, with other issues that we have, like hate. You can quickly analyze and see this content is hateful and moderate and remove it from the platform. But when it comes to disinformation, because we are always trying to be making sure that we are not silencing people because of how they're expressing themselves. So it always takes time. And by the time we do identify, we do have within TikTok dedicated teams that just work on identifying covert influences. That is their full-time job. So they take a lot of time to follow, to research. So their moderation and how we respond always takes more time than any other violations. And sometimes during that time, we are catching a lot of criticism. We reported this 2 days ago, 3 days ago. It takes a while to actually investigate and get to that kind of conclusion, especially for covert influences. As many of you have spoken about how smart they are, always trying to stay on the safe side of our community guidelines, but we do have dedicated teams that are very smart. And then when it comes to misinformation and that was especially around elections, and many of you we have engaged with government. We've got big teams, our communications team, myself, I am within the trust and safety team. So anything that relates to safety on the platform itself, you can escalate it to me. We do have dedicated channels. For some of the people in this group have access and they've reported, and I'm sure they can confirm and respond and say we stay on point in terms of responding. We do not allow for any case to go for over 72 hours without the verdict. Even if it is not violating, we will still come back to you and explain why it is not violating. Similar for government, similar for communications, we have dedicated channels. Some of the things that we were doing before the elections, we had a huge user education campaign that we launched on app because we believe that's where people are consuming the content. So we were working with creators, we were working with Africa Check. We reached over 28 million people on TikTok alone using the elections hashtags. And there was a lot of engagement. We see more people reporting content directly, which is one of the things that we are always encouraging users to directly report the content to us. But we also appreciate programs like Real 411, where people can go and report, because if it is escalated to us as well, there's that sense, as William said, that when something comes from a partner, we know directly that there is very high likelihood that it is actually violating, unlike when it's just a normal everyday user, because they see something they do not agree with, they report it to us. So it's a high volume of reports, which there is a very low rate of actual violations. So we are excited about the 2026 elections, which is why we are here. The election cycle has not ended for us. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dudu, for that input. Really appreciate it. I will now open up for questions from the audience and, of course, the online audience as well. And please go ahead. Thank you, Josiah. And then, okay, we'll do Josiah and we'll do you and then last you. Thanks, Josiah.
Yeah, thanks. So, Musa Wenkosi mentions the proliferation of podcasts across the continent. Should we be concerned as they proliferate. And I'm saying this from government, not necessarily wanting to hang out our dirty linen. When it comes to the broadcast we know that it has been being amended, but no conclusion to that. So we don't necessarily have a tool to regulate that space regarding. So should we be concerned, really?
Thank you, Josiah.
Hi, I'm Hanley from News 24. Are we allowed to ask questions to Dudu?
Yes, Dudu? I'm sure she's fine.
Okay, my question is for you and perhaps for Musa as well, and William might also know some of this. How many checks and balances are there for local languages on social media platforms? And in your engagement with platforms, is this something that comes up? The only other South African language I'm fluent in is Afrikaans. We have reported misinformation, disinformation, and plain and simple abuse and racism. Necklacing, for instance, is a very South African term. Twitter does not concern threatening somebody with being necklaced as an issue. TikTok does not consider wishing for the old days of apartheid to return as an issue. So in that whole sphere of online abuse as well as disinformation, misinformation, how much emphasis is there on languages that are not English? Thanks.
Thank you, Hanley. Now over to you, Nomshado.
Thank you. I'll really try not to ask hard questions, but thank you, Prof. Musa, for bringing in, I think, the issue of language, because I think it's one of the areas that we don't necessarily look into quite a lot. And the reason why I say this is there's a linguistic diversity influence that happens across the continent when it comes to these campaigns, particularly looking, for example, what happens in East Africa, which is the second largest, area of the continent that experiences these campaigns. And looking at countries such as Egypt, we barely highlight those in comparison to Sudan, for example. So the language question, is it something that we're really looking into? Because I know you mentioned, English versus, for example, in Nigeria, there's countless languages in comparison to, for example, in South Africa, we've got 11 official, but there's still non-official languages, which a lot of the slang and the narratives kind of also feed into. So that's one question. My other one is really around the interplay between domestic and, I'd say geopolitical influence in a way. You touched on that. And I think earlier on it was mentioned from the report around echo chambers and algorithm enforcement that happens at the back end, which influencers have kind of like tapped into. Is it something that we're also kind of trying to put a spotlight on in understanding? Because I'd like to believe if they are reaching out to each other in terms of understanding how to kind of influence these spaces, is it a space that perhaps can also be used to kind of get into the nibs of?
Okay, thank you, Nomshado. So I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to give some input on some of the particular questions, but also just your insights into what was shared. And I'll start with you, Musa.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll respond to your question first. Yes, you should be concerned. There are podcasts that are not, well, all of them are not necessarily regulated. They say they have ideological positions, which is not a problem, but they say things about individuals, institutions, countries. And there's basically some of those things are things that cannot be said either by the SABC, ETV, Media 24, or anybody else. And they have huge following. And as it has been said here, sometimes we don't know who the sponsors are as much as they present themselves as, as an alternative voice. So there ought to be, regulation, but within the parameters of the Constitution. Just the second point close to that, it's not necessarily something that you can regulate, but I think that the continent in terms of disinformation, all kinds of campaigns is going to change. Because, say, Iran might have be, militarily defeated, but is not going to roll over and die. The influence of Russia in the continent might be limited by the changing geopolitics, what happened in Israel, what happens in Lebanon, what happens in Yemen, what happens in the region, but it's not about to roll over and die. Okay? And the biggest investors in our country that are growing very strong is UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There's a competition between themselves, but this is beyond the scope of the discussion here. Part of the point I am trying to make is that a number of the countries that we have relationships with in the BRICS constellation or context, and to be blunt, apart from Brazil and India and South Africa, are not necessarily open democracies. And they don't necessarily have the kind of freedom of the media that you would get in India, in Brazil, and in South Africa. Okay? So a number of our friends are not the people who really would love to see open, democratic, thriving media space. So you should be worried. I think this kind of value system that we have cultivated around media, we are not necessarily the best, but the environment is going to change because of also the change in economic relations that we're going to have going forward. The issue about languages, if you use multi-choice, DSTV, remote control, you can stop swearing in English, but you can't really do that with all the telenovelas in isiZulu, isiXhosa, in other languages as well. I don't know if it is feasible for any media house to be able to monitor all of these languages, but they may need to deal with the issue of content regulation at the production level earlier on. TikTok, Meta, everybody else, I haven't seen any monitoring of kind of disinformation that takes place in other languages other than the English language. And some of the things that one came across in July 2-3 years back when there were riot, looting, was really frightening, but it was circulating in the spaces without any monitoring. I think that answers your questions. Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't know how that case is going because it was postponed. On that, Herman?
Yeah, maybe I'll say something about language. I think it's a well-known fact, or it's been for a while a point of controversy, that the regulation and moderation around the world happens mostly in English, and that the number of users of Meta's platforms, for instance, in languages other than English, actually much bigger than in English. So there's been a long-term discrepancy also in terms of how those platforms have been treating moderators. For instance, we know the cases where moderators and regulators have been treated very badly outside of, in places like Kenya and so on. But I think for me, another question here is maybe a slightly broader question, and that is in terms of not only moderation, regulation, again, how we tackle the specific instances of disinformation or hate and extreme speech, but what are the underlying attitudes? And I think this is, for me, a more important point to make about, again, the long-term addressing of something like disinformation is you can try and address the symptoms and you can regulate the symptoms, but the disinformation and the hate, those are symptoms of much deeper problems, right? So the reason why, for instance, Russian disinformation gets traction is because they are anti-Western attitudes. Those are the underlying attitudes. Now you can say, well, that's a good thing or a bad thing depending on where you stand. But the point is that unless you start thinking about what are these, and we've seen across Africa, Afrobarometer studies and so on have shown us that there's a steep decline in attitudes towards the West and towards democracy even. So that is why those narratives get traction. Similarly, in language, if you think about the Afrikaans, for instance, the reason why, and let's also maybe talk about another elephant in the room, and that is disinformation increasingly in the last few weeks have not only come from China and Russia, okay, it's come from the US. So the reason why Trump's points about land expropriation and so on got traction among Afrikaans audiences, and you can debunk those instances, but it's more important, I think, to try and understand where are those audiences located, what attitudes are they displaying, what makes them more vulnerable then to also things like Putin's idea of a strong conservative religious leader, etc. These are very deep-seated attitudes. And unless you have a really strong knowledge, not only of the language, by which I mean the grammar and the syntax and the vocabulary, but the whole cultural context within which these people operate, you are only going to do this sort of whack-a-mole. And for democracy and elections and to survive in the long run, we have to foster democratic attitudes. So we have to go deeper and try to understand what those attitudes are. And for that, you need a contextual and a cultural knowledge that includes language, but also includes all sorts of other things about people's world views, etc. So that, I think, is a really important point that I think we should be taking forward.
Thank you, Hannah. William, as someone who has worked or looked at the SABC since the dawn of democracy, of course, language, such a pivotal issue. But talk to us about, some of your, insights, but also to the question that, Hannah-Lee and also our colleague from GCIS had raised.
So language is really interesting, particularly for African language stations in SABC, where they're by far and away the biggest media in the country. And what was the case just after 94 was that they were still in this kind of apartheid mindset where everything was done in either Afrikaans or English and then backward translated into African language news bulletins, and then that was appropriately broadcast. And so you saw a clear mirroring of what was on the English language, Afrikaans language, and then that shifted to be dominated by English, where that was the primary kind of driver of what framed the news for African language speakers, which was kind of perverse, really, but that was how it was. And that shifted a lot, largely because of social media. But now you've got this really interesting interplay between the social media agenda and the news media agenda. So for the first time, when we did our monitoring of news organizations, medias, we monitored 75 of them or something, we had an issue which was the Israel-Palestine, which was on the topic agenda for how the media covered the elections. And that's pretty astonishing. But of course, when we listened to the research that was done, you could see there was a clear agenda, which talks about how media themselves inform and are informed by the social media agenda. So that starts to frame those overall set of issues that we are told to think about in an election period. And when we put so we looked at IEC on social media, and you looked at IEC across news media, and the shape of those graphs is almost identical, where sometimes news media is ahead of the curve. They'll be talking about the IEC, and then the social media will pick up on it, and other times the social media is ahead, but the shape of them overall is remarkably similar, which is very, I think, really interesting. And that's across African English language, that you get those very similar trends and that common pattern of framing narratives. And I think that's something that we can, it's a strength and a weakness, of course, but it's something that I think we can work with to help inform and shape that narrative as we head, or those narratives as we head towards 2026. And then I think that part of the answers to these things are fairly clear and obvious. They're things that we use to hold democratic institutions accountable. Transparency and accountability, and those things start to then feed into and build trust, right? So we should be talking now about the value that the IEC brings to our democratic space. The reason that we knew and understood about the things that we did in the elections was precisely because the IEC was giving regular news and updates on whatever was happening every single day. All of the things, the processes that were there, that were painstakingly clearly spelled out. And those things are critical in that period, but they're also critical now. That reinforcement of the importance of democratic institutions, just how they differ from someone who can come in like a bull in a china shop, a cluster musk, and just destroy whatever kinds of things are there, right? And so at the moment, and for GCIS, it's a case of reasserting the importance of rights, the importance of transparency, the importance of accountability and democratic process. And then we need to apply those same principles to the platforms. They don't like it. One of the reasons we all know that Musk and Zuckerberg are such big buddies with Trump is precisely because he wants to see the abolishment of any kind of regulation, and they're targeting the EU precisely because of the regulations that they are increasingly having to put in place to force a level of accountability and transparency on the platforms. So we're going to face that as a much smaller country. Do we have answers? I think we do, actually. Because again, we've got one of the best constitutions in the world, and we should be bloody proud of that fact. We've got a very proud, strong history, lots of problems, etc. But this is the continent where actually we're going to have the answers for the globe on a range of these things, on all of them, actually.
Thank you, William. Some last points from you, Aldo?
I think on the questions on language and algorithmic bias and so on, I think what I can contribute here is that from Murmur, what we always try to do is we try to step out of the daily life of social media. We really try to we pull lots of data, and our biggest insight always is for people to realize when you're on social media, you're in that system. When you're on Twitter, when you're on TikTok, when you're on WhatsApp, you're experiencing that buffeting of the daily life that these algorithms and everything enforce on you. Once you take a step back and you look at this data at large from a kind of a neutral perspective, which was the case in this particular study, and that's how we always approach these things, you become quite aware that there are, I can give you lists of extremely racist Afrikaans groups on Telegram, for instance, where you will write stories to the end of days, very juicy stuff about very idiotic people that believe the hype that Telegram is private. I can pull all of that data. WhatsApp's private. I can't pull that data, but I can pull it on Telegram. So these people are openly and vehemently racist. I can give you names, they're very entertaining. But if you spend your days trying to attack these people, they're small fish. And you're going to keep yourself extremely busy there. And what I always say, I call that dark social. Trying to get into every single language, every single context, every single niche, every single racist and misogynist and so on. If you try to get into all of those, which is a noble cause, it's like trying to go to a braai and policing people at their braais. Sure, there is a place for that, and as each individual, we should take some responsibility at a braai and say, that's not on, not in front of me at least. But as bigger organizations, as government, that's not necessarily the place for us to have effect. So we need to think, where can we have efficient application of our attention? And what we normally then see is that the majority, I would say 98% of all true problematic issues do end up in English on Twitter, for instance, or on Facebook. And we don't even have to hunt for them in the dark social spaces. Now, there is definitely a place for hunting in the dark social spaces because for more of the intelligence arenas of our society, try to understand and stop very problematic people from doing very problematic things. But when we talk about national and geopolitical narratives, they die because people like Jean is on Twitter. Because Formula 1 is there, because TikTok does their job. They're bucking the trend and actually taking some responsibility. But they're never going to handle all the cases of longing for the old days. That's a good case, and that they can now add that. But there will always be these little examples, and if we keep rushing towards them, we're going to completely miss the point. So my thing is distance and perspective, and we should coordinate for efficient application of our attention of these organizations to see how we can handle this and help these narratives not become destructive, not run away, and for people to, we say civic education in digital literacy, it's really, I would say, I would spend more time doing digital literacy with higher people and not the average Joe. I would spend that time with policymakers to help them understand if you're on Twitter, you're vulnerable to its algorithms. And then you can say algorithmic bias. It's you. If you hover slightly too long on a criticism of you or your party or of this, you're going to be fed that narrative. That's it. And there are some dodgy things. If you're a male, you're only interested in cars, you will get half-naked females, and it's going to happen. And that's the platform's problem. It's not necessarily you. But so we say. So I would start with literacy, not with average Joe. I would start it at the very top. Educate, be on the platform, but understand that you're now at the whim of the platform. So rather use organizations to step out of it and observe.
Step out of it and observe. Thank you, Aldo. Dudu, would you mind able to answer the question that Hanneli had posed? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Just to say, to start, TikTok has got over 40,000 people dedicated just to trust and safety, and we've got amazing AI technology. We moderate all type of content, no matter the language. If you have seen our efforts, if you have seen the work that we do, if you have seen content that is violating in any language, in isiXhosa, in isiZulu, and you say we missed this content, it's not because of the language, it's because we were not aware of that particular trend. And as soon as we are aware, we work on how to moderate it, we fit it into the system. For example, this, as you just mentioned, longing for the old days. Some of these things are not as easy to. When something comes to our attention, when I get back, we take it, we look at it, we say, who else can confirm that this is harmful? How do we ascertain the harm in real life? Because if we start banning every word that is being mentioned as hateful, then the people will never be free. So we take we test the words that are sent to us, or the sentences or the phrases, no matter which language, we test them to see, to assess if they are being hateful, what is the impact in real life if this content is left on the platform. And if we can ascertain that this is really harmful, we then fit it into the system, communicate, issue guidance to our moderators to say, going forward, this is harmful. But every day there's new phrases, new trends in all types of languages that we have to test and assess. And people who mean harm every day are creating new ways. As soon as you ban one word, there is a new word showing up. So, which is why we come to these kinds of events, so that we get what are we missing, what are we not keeping our eyes on, what are the developments, so that we take that insight to the team and say, apparently we are missing this and it is harmful. Let's test it and see if we can moderate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dudu. I've got an online question from Sebastian in Brussels. He was part of the event last year, and that's a question to the entire panel. He is looking at the geopolitical competition and how foreign actors engaged the South African actors and its infrastructures you talked about, and he just wants to get some insights in that, and also is there opportunities, of course, for other research that is needed, and I'm sure as academics you will say yes. But Musa, we'll start with you. Any insights on this particular question from Sebastian around the kind of foreign actors, and the kind of geopolitical competition we have?
That is that is happening, and there is, for a lack of a better phrase, a scramble for African informational space. But I think one of the things that the questions we should ask, to what end? Africa brings to the UN General Assembly more than 50 countries. That is a big voting base on a range of issues. So there are countries that could be facing sanctions and they want friends. There are countries that are isolated, that there are countries that want to be bigger in their regions, that they need the continent. So, but they do not only need the leaders, they also need the people in that continent. So they use, I was thinking about it yesterday in terms of the theory, we call it the two steps flow in the media and communication space, that there are legitimate leaders that they use, and those people will then influence other people as well. So I think for me, that's the communication model that I will use. That they form formal relationships with some people who are in power, and those people would then link themselves to certain constituencies using various kinds of communicative platforms. So there's stuff that is happening online, there's stuff that's happening offline, and in other areas as well. But there is a desire to influence. The tactics might be different, given that different countries may have different needs, and some may use cultural soft power, religious soft power, etc., etc. But there is a scramble to influence the continent for various kinds of causes that the external players are facing in various parts of the world.
Herman, so on that, we do see the scramble, and we see it viscerally in West Africa in particular, Burkina Faso, Mali, that have withdrawn from ECOWAS, etc. Would you be able to say that it's also, we're seeing particular nuances in East Africa and Southern Africa?
Well, I don't know if what I wanted to say, maybe, if I may, I think there are particular nuances well, if we look at East Africa, South Africa, Kenya and South Africa, for instance, I think what makes us specific is that we both have, Kenya and South Africa, for instance, have strong media systems. They have very robust and very noisy democracies. There's a lot of people online. And that's also the places where then a lot of this influence, I think, happens through media and through media-related, so social media and so on, whereas maybe in the ECOWAS region, I think the influence might have, there have also been, in Mali and the Sahel and so on, on Facebook and so on as well. But I think what is interesting about South Africa and Kenya, for instance, especially, is this very strong mediated political communication landscape. But if I may, I just wanted to pick up on the two questions. The one question is, how does this influence happen? And Musa's just referred to that. I think there are different levels. And so one of the terms being used is hybrid warfare. So you have the soft power, and soft power depends on who we speak to. The US has had soft power in South Africa for many years, and that's where the term soft power originates from, Hollywood and jeans and hamburgers. But Russia and China have another type of soft power, and that is sometimes referred to as memory diplomacy. They have supported the liberation movements, and they then like to remind us about that. So that's sort of more of a form of soft power. But then there are the harder power underneath that, and the sharp power sometimes referred to, and that happens online through disinformation, influence operations, etc. And as we've seen, that then gets amplified through local buzzes and influences and these sort of things. So I think one has to be aware that this influence happens on many different levels, and not only in the disinformation space, but happens also on this sort of soft power. And I think what is going to be interesting to watch is how the US is doing the bidding starting to do that bidding by alienating. For instance, I think in South Africa, the last 2 weeks, I didn't think it would be a stretch of the imagination to say that people will, it has done the sort of pivoting towards BRICS, the pivoting towards Russia and China has been done a favor by the US attacking South Africa, for instance, and alienating that, we've already seen that in President Ramaphosa's speech last night, the response to that. So on the one hand, there's soft power and influence, and then there's also the inverse of what you do to alienate people, I think, and alienate countries. And if I may just then quickly on research, I think what is important, and this was I really like about Jean Carin's report, is that it also does the sort of ethnographic interviewing sort of work. And I think there's a lot of that needs to happen still. A lot of the work in this space is done on the level of content and scraping and data analysis, and all of that is really important, but I think it has to be complemented increasingly by spending time with people, speaking to them, understanding what their attitudes are. Why do they share disinformation? Why does certain bits of information get traction? Again, here's the cultural and language issue comes into play. So that sort of work just, and that it can be, and in that way you can also get around some of the data access issues, for instance, around WhatsApp. You can't access WhatsApp data, but you can sit with somebody, get their trust and say, show me how you use WhatsApp, scroll through your messages, show me where, who do you trust? Oh, there's a message from your grandmother, and I see you didn't correct her. Or there's a message from your faith leader. How do you feel about that? That sort of work, I think that ethnographic work, and some of us have started to do that. I think that the scope for that is still huge in terms of the research that we do.
Thank you, Herman. William, over to you, but I also just want you to add, given that we have the G20 presidency, of course, the US again, setting the agenda, but it is, South Africa's presidency, and how do we build on the work that Brazil did, in particularly around disinformation and misinformation, because we'll only have the presidency for the next 10 months.
So there are actually quite a few movements in this regard. South African National Editors Forum and ourselves and a bunch of others are looking at trying to ensure that there's a Media 20, specifically with a view of highlighting critical information integrity, media sustainability issues. Prof. Berger, sitting over there, has actually done an excellent kind of issues paper on this. And we're busy circulating this with the various people in relating to the G20. I guess the thing we have to be cautious of is to not let ourselves get caught in those same kind of narrative traps, which is that they're making a lot of these things about kind of identity politics, as though sustainability, diversity, equality, like these are now considered extreme left-wing woke ideas, right? I mean, that's just crazy. That's just complete insanity, because that isn't what the left fundamentally is about. It's not what a rights-based equality, dignity society is about fundamentally, right? It's those things are about shifting particular issues in society and structures in order to realize dignity and equality for all. These are things that we've got extensive African precedent for, based on the our African Declaration and numerous other principles and documents. So I think that we as South Africa are uniquely placed to actually have a meaningful input on these issues with this G20. And I say meaningful because in as much as Brazil tried to get these issues there, if you read the final declaration from Brazil 2023, whatever that thing was called, but when you read that, there's one line in the whole thing about mis and disinformation, and that's because there was so much opposition to having any mention of it in there. Apparently the Argentinian president was the one who was saying they would refuse to sign if this was even mentioned. And the word is that our president was introduced the notion of sufficient consensus in order to push ahead and reach agreement with that final idea. But I think that combined with our case to the ICJ, and if you look at the president's speech last night, that response, which is kind of the 5-year-old throwing their toys in order to get attention, versus what our president said last night, a reassertion of values, of democratic ideas, of dignity, of equality, of Ubuntu, these sorts of things, I think is a critical set of ideas to put on the table that hopefully we can then get some direction on. And if the USA, as indicated by Marco Rubio, said, I'm not going to be coming because South Africa is doing bad things. We're doing bad things to bad people, or good people, i.e. white men. Shame, we have it the worst in the world, apparently. Poor white men. Anyway, and that if they continue to isolate themselves, it actually opens that possibility for this G20 to actually have a little bit more of an impact. But even if we don't get that, and Guy was the one who pointed this out to me very kindly and politely, was these things are a big political bag, and it's highly unlikely that any of the real issues are likely to get into that final statement. But what it does do is it gives us an opportunity to start to really build a lot more of a collaborative and meaningful movement on these issues, because the dark forces are very strong now. And this is like the biggest battle we're ever going to have, where you've now got dark forces coming from all corners, and they've got real power, and they're doing away with all of the guardrails. Google's decision to remove that line about preventing overall harm is massive. I think that's a very real worry. The fact that one of Trump's first things that he did was to remove the Biden set of AI guidelines, I think is also really, really incredibly significant. So all of those tools now, it's just is like open season to do what the hell you like, when you like, how you like. So we've got an opportunity to collaborate and to make sure that there is still some semblance. Otherwise, fascism, here we come.
And final word to you, Aldo. I mean, as William pointed out, the dark forces are there. It's the floodgates, and as a data, expert, clearly there's a lot of work out there for you.
Yeah, I think we also post the invasion of Ukraine is where the scramble for Africa really took off. The scramble of influencing Africa, and it took us a while to understand why. Why would the most obvious thing is, firstly, there was in the pressure to put pressure on Russia. So that Africa was the leak, because they could just turn to Africa and relieve some of that pressure. And then, the West suddenly realized, there's this thing Africa is. They don't just need aid; they, they actually have some role to play. So, and now you've got this kind of back push from the West to try to, scramble for some foothold again, especially now trying to play on the playing fields that Russia, etc., have been playing on. So we're right in the middle of that. I think with the changes in the US, is we will always see in politics these swings and backswings. I think we're seeing this backswing now. It's unfortunate that the people riding that backswing have this particular flavor, and they would obviously inevitably cause an overswing to the other side, if I were to give my opinion. But I think this last week we're observing, and I spoke to, we showed some data yesterday that Josias organized, where the last time we saw US politics really pulling into our data was also around white genocide, farm murders, and so on, around 2016. But it only pulled the South African right, white right, towards them trying to appeal and used it as examples of white genocide globally and so on. Not really caring about what's happening locally, but as an example for them. This is now the first time we see the American right and left pulling us. It's the first time we see the left really waging into our discussions as well, and we're now I made the point yesterday, which is I don't 100% agree with my own statement, but it's a statement that I think it's worth contemplating. Is we should be very careful not to play into this US perspective on our politics, because they're fundamentally a different type of let's call it political social society than us. We're more, us and Kenya are very similar. Central media, everyone weighs in, but you've got the central media. But then you've got the US, they don't have central media. So what they will inevitably do is they will completely bifurcate us into echo chambers, and then we will completely lose the ability to operate on the same, generally the same assumptions, the ways of interacting and how we work. And so we should be very careful to not be adversarial in our response to the funny things that the Trump administration uses from our context. We shouldn't, we should be careful in how we respond. That obviously fact check, because some of those are complete lies, but I think we should be very careful not to let them define our politics from now on.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of the panel and also our half-day conference. But I don't have the task, but my colleague, who's the rapporteur, Nomshado Lubisi, formerly from Media Monitoring Africa, now Code for Africa, will give us a brief summary of this morning's panel discussions. Thank you, Nomshado, and we look forward to your brief, concise pulling it all together for us. Yeah, you can come. Okay, go for it. Oh.
Yep.
This role is usually difficult in conversations like these because you don't want to leave out anything important or obviously summarize in 5 minutes something that is honestly only a quarter of the conversations that was had. So what I did was I kind of concluded everything in thematic or key thematic areas rather that were discussed by our two sessions in terms of panels. And I think starting off with the kind of summary that was given by Karen and John regarding the report, which I think everyone will still dive deep into. We're looking at influence actors and motivation and really highlighting how influencers both on social media and other platforms play a significant role in amplifying false information. However, the key question around ethical access to credible information and how to hold these actors to account becomes the question. And also looking at the challenging impact of algorithms and echo chambers that really do rather prioritize engagement over factual and accurate information.
Second to that was looking at the impact on democracy, a critical issue, I think, which was raised in terms of, number one, media's role in this, and at the second time, looking at social media platforms and how they can also be held accountable. But second to that, I think this dichotomy underpins the need for more robust mechanisms to ensure accuracy and integrity when it comes to content being shared online and offline. And in the third one is looking at consolidated efforts to really address disinformation. And I think the realization of us always huddling together, usually just before elections, and really trying to put those efforts together at that point kind of brings a disservice to our efforts. So the discussion emphasized obviously the need to really have a more coordinated effort in bringing together all these key institutions, but time frame is key. And I think the other, which was around the challenges around voter education, if we're going to focus on elections. And I think Sai really did highlight this in terms of, number one, there's efforts, rather challenges faced when it comes to voter education, which in this case would be, the competitive nature of political campaigns during that period. Second to that is the lack of adequate financial and technical support to ensure that these campaigns are efficient enough. Also looking at the mere fact that these are also an impact when it comes to long-term success points when it comes to voter education, and looking at those gaps in how we can actually consolidate effort to ensure that voter education is a long-term campaign rather than a short-term campaign. Looking at the monitoring and research mechanisms in place, and I think this was really highlighted at the end by our panel, how do we diversify our research and analysis to actually start looking at methodologies that allow us to go on ground and start actually understanding the interaction between cultural trust, society, and their perspective on societal issues. The other was looking at policy development. So how do we ensure that regulatory frameworks that does protect free expression, while obviously the need to address the spread of mis and disinformation, given the mere fact that these are platforms, number one, I think TikTok being here, with limitations when it comes to continental or even local alignment when it comes to policy and regulation. And I think concluding in that, and the key thematic areas, which I really did try to summarize in 5 minutes, is to look at how do we indeed have a sustained coordinated effort when it comes to combating mis and disinformation, but most importantly, when it comes to the electoral outcomes and democratic integrity, rather.
Wow, you leave me speechless, and that's not often something. Thank you very much. Of course, this was a half-day conference. I found it very useful. Firstly, a big thanks to the ISS, Fonte, for your guidance and direction. To Karen and her team, excellent report. There's going to be lots of discussions. You've planted the seed, and I think it's going to live long, both in our academic institutions from UCT to Stellenbosch to, of course, the work that William is doing, not only in South Africa, but in the continent. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you to our panel, panel one, for the engagement. Of course, the IEC. Sai, we know you're a very busy man, so we really appreciate your time for coming and sharing with us. Josiah, it's not always easy to get GCIS in a room, so we appreciate the insights, that you shared with us. And of course, in this room, there are people that are more than willing to hold your hand. We know it's not an easy task, so thank you. Of course, also a big thank you to Dudu, who was kind enough to share with us what's the inner workings and mechanics of TikTok. And so please, in this room, there is Dudu. Do take her details and, call her. Sai, you can call her if there's any issues with TikTok. And then, of course, our academics and people that are, influencing the next generation of academics. Thank you for your insights, and we look forward to more research coming from you. And then, of course, our online audience, thank you for the questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get through all of it, but I do think that our panelists were able to share some of the insights with regards to some of those questions. And it's the end of our half-day session. Lunch, as Kathy pointed out and reminded me, will be served on the second floor. Do enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.